You probably think you know how your mind works. You think your thoughts are your own, that you see the world clearly, that your decisions are free. But what if all of that was an illusion? This is a journey through 100 mental traps, biases, and blind spots that shape how you see, remember, decide, and even exist. Some are simple, others strange, and still others so deep that they could change how you see reality itself. It does not get more difficult at each step, but it does get deeper, until, in the end, even the idea that you're watching this video may not be as solid as it seems. This is level 1 of 100 illusions and cognitive biases. Let's begin. You tend to look for evidence that supports what you already believe and ignore or dismiss anything questioning it. That is confirmation bias, and it silently shapes how you see the world. If you believe that a certain diet is the healthiest, you will notice all the articles and testimonies that praise it, and you will overlook the studies or experiences that contradict it. If you think someone is rude, you will remember every moment in which they seem abrupt or dismissive, but forget the times they were kind or neutral. You collect evidence that supports it like a lawyer preparing a case, not like a scientist seeking truth. Even how you search for information on the internet is biased. You don't usually write, "Why could I be wrong?" You write, "Why am I right?" And search engines give you exactly what you're looking for. Social networks worsen the situation by surrounding you with people and content that already agree with you, creating an echo chamber in which your opinions are constantly reinforced. Over time, your confidence grows, not because your ideas are more accurate, but because you have filtered out everything disagreeing with them. The scary thing is how natural it feels. You don't think you're being biased. You think you are only seeing the facts, but in reality, you are seeing a selected version of reality, one fitting your existing narrative. This makes it harder to change your mind, even when you should. Confirmation bias not only protects your beliefs, but also your identity. Questioning your opinions may seem like questioning who you are, but the truth doesn't care what you believe. You look at two lines that are exactly the same length, but one of them looks longer, and your brain is absolutely convinced. That is the Muller-Lyer illusion, one of the simplest and most famous visual tricks ever discovered. You will see two horizontal lines. One has arrows pointing outwards, and the other has arrows pointing inwards. The one with arrows pointing inwards always seems shorter, although mathematically, they are identical. You can measure them with a ruler. You can stare at them for minutes. You may know that they are the same length, but the illusion does not disappear. This happens because your brain is trying to do something useful. It's not just about random errors. The illusion plays with how we interpret depth and perspective in everyday life. When we see corners or angles in the real world, our brain automatically adjusts for distance. The arrows trick us into believing that a line is further away, so we unconsciously scale its size to compensate. It's as if your brain was trying to turn a 2D drawing into a 3D experience, and that translation introduces an error. The powerful thing about the Muller-Lyer illusion is that it is not just a curiosity. It is a reminder that perception is not passive. You're not simply recording the world like a camera. Your brain actively interprets it, guesses, adjusts, and fills in the gaps based on experience. And sometimes those assumptions are wrong. Even when you know the truth, you still see the lie. It is not only a peculiarity of vision. It is a pattern that you will see again and again in how the mind functions. The illusion is just the beginning. The first number you hear gets stuck in your mind like a magnet, even if it is totally random, and silently influences everything afterward. That is anchoring bias. Imagine that you are buying a watch. The first one you see costs $500. The next one costs $300. Suddenly, $300 seems like a bargain, even though it is still expensive. The second watch has not changed, only your point of reference. The first number has planted an anchor, and your brain has used it to judge everything else. Anchoring does not affect only money. It appears in negotiations, estimations, judgments, and even conjectures. If I ask you if the Mississippi River is longer or shorter than 2,000 kilometers, and then ask you to guess its real length, your answer will probably be around 2,000 kilometers, even though that number has come out of nowhere. The same thing happens in courts when prosecutors ask for extreme sentences. It makes any lesser punishment seem reasonable by comparison. Real estate agents set high sale prices so that buyers feel they're making a good deal after the negotiation, even though the final price is still inflated. The strange thing is that even when you know that the anchor is arbitrary or irrelevant, it still affects you. Studies have been carried out in which the participants spin a roulette that stops at a random number and then answer questions that have nothing to do with the number, but their answers are still biased toward that random number. The effect is so powerful that it is as if your brain could not use the anchor. The anchoring bias demonstrates how irrational we can be when making decisions. We like to think that we carefully weigh all the facts, but often the first information we find sets the tone, and everything afterwards simply follows it. The danger is that we rarely realize that this happens. The anchoring hides in plain sight, influencing our decisions without us realizing it. From the prices we accept to the objectives we set ourselves, passing through the expectations we have for ourselves. And once the anchor is launched, it takes great mental effort to raise it again. You think you realize everything around you, but in reality, you miss much more than you think. Change blindness is the illusion that we are constantly aware of our environment, when we often do not even realize the important changes that occur in front of us. You could be watching a scene from a movie and not realize that a character's shirt has changed color between shots. You could be conversing with someone and not realize that they have been replaced by a completely different person. Yes, that has been done in experiments. People nodded, kept talking, and did not realize that something had changed. This illusion reveals something deep about how your mind works. We do not capture the world like a camera. We capture it through fragments, points of attention, and our brain fills the rest in. This gives us the sensation of a rich and stable image. But a large part of that image is an illusion built from assumptions, expectations, and memories. If something changes outside our focus of attention, it often goes unnoticed. It is not because we are careless. It is because your brain is efficient. It assumes that most of the world remains the same and only points out what seems important. But that assumption means that you can overlook things that are obvious in retrospect. Change blindness is not just a peculiar trick of the eye. It has real consequences. Crime witnesses often overlook key details. Drivers do not realize the presence of cyclists or pedestrians. We believe that we are observers, but our consciousness is like a flashlight in a dark room. It only shows what we point at. The rest fades into assumptions. And, nevertheless, we walk through life with confidence, believing that we see the complete picture. That calm confidence is an illusion. And the blindness to change is the proof that what we miss can be more important than we think. You enter a room and feel that everyone is looking at you, your clothes, your hair, that small stain on your shirt that you saw in the mirror. You feel as if a spotlight is following you, highlighting every clumsy movement or imperfect detail. But here is the twist. Almost nobody has noticed. That is the spotlight effect. It is the tendency to overestimate dramatically the attention that others pay you. In reality, most people are too busy thinking about themselves to notice you or remember much about you. That uncomfortable comment you made, you repeat it in your head for hours, but most likely nobody else has given it importance. That time you tripped, said the wrong name, or wore mismatched socks. You felt mortified, but for others it was an unimportant moment, if they even noticed it. The spotlight effect comes from a simple fact that we live inside our own heads. We experience our thoughts, emotions, and awareness of ourselves with full intensity. Therefore, we assume that others are tuned in to the same level, but it is not so. They are under their own spotlights, worried about their own defects and mistakes, not observing each of your movements. This illusion can make us too cautious, anxious, or fearful of taking risks. We avoid raising our hand, speaking, or showing ourselves vulnerable because we believe that we are constantly being judged. But, in reality, everyone is immersed in their own worries, just like you. The spotlight that blinds you so much is mostly a product of your imagination. And, as soon as you realize it, you begin to feel a little more free, because nobody is watching you as closely as you think. Your brain tends to judge the probability or frequency of something based on how easily an example occurs to you. That is the availability heuristic. If you have just seen a plane crash on the news, flying suddenly seems more dangerous, although statistically it is still incredibly safe. If someone close to you has recently become ill after eating out, you may feel that restaurant food is riskier than it is. When something is vivid, recent, dramatic, or charged with emotion, it is etched in your memory, and your brain confuses that ease of remembering it with frequency or truth. This mental shortcut helps you make quick decisions without needing all the data, but can seriously distort your perception of reality. You could think that crime is increasing because you hear about it more often, even though crime in general may be decreasing. You might believe that shark attacks are common because they're unforgettable, although you are much more likely to be injured by a ladder than a shark. The media plays an important role in this. They flood your mind with uncommon dramatic events, making them seem normal or frequent just because they are memorable. The complicated thing is that the availability heuristic seems natural. You're not consciously trying to misjudge the world. You rely on the first thing that comes to mind. But what comes to mind is not always the most important thing. The fact that something is easy to remember does not mean that it is common. And the fact that something is difficult to imagine does not mean that it is rare. Your memory is a summary of the highlights, not a census. Recognizing it can help you make better decisions, especially when the facts do not seem as obvious as the stories. You tend to believe that most people think like you, that your opinions are normal, that your values are common, and that your preferences are widely shared. This is the false consensus effect, and it creates a mental bubble in which your perspective feels like the norm. If you love a particular program, you assume that everyone must know it. If you have a firm political belief, you are likely to think that it is the reasonable and obvious position, and wonder how it is possible that someone could disagree. This bias gives you the comforting illusion that your opinions are part of a shared reality, when they may be much less common than you think. It manifests everywhere, in discussions on social networks, in electoral behavior, even in everyday conversations. People tend to overestimate how many people would lie to protect a friend, how many would cheat on an exam, how many believe in the same conspiracy theory or none. And the more emotionally charged or identity-based a belief is, the stronger the illusion becomes. We do not only think that others agree with us. We assume those who disagree must be misinformed, biased, or extremist. The false consensus effect leads to poor decisions, overconfidence, and failure to understand others. It can cause people to speak on behalf of everyone when, in reality, they speak only for themselves. And it makes disagreements feel more personal than they really are, because they are perceived as a rejection of not only your opinion, but of what you believed was common sense. Ironically, this bias is why we are surprised when reality contradicts us. When we discover our opinion is a minority or that people we thought we understood think differently. It can be humbling to realize that your version of normal is just that, your version. The world is full of people in different bubbles, each convinced that the majority thinks like them. And when those bubbles collide, it's not always pleasant, but it can be revealing. You think the odds will even out, that after bad luck, it's your turn to win. That is the gambler's fallacy. The belief that past random events influence future ones. Toss a coin, and it comes up heads 5 times straight. You feel like it has to come up tails. But the truth is, the coin doesn't care. Each toss still has a 50% chance, regardless of previous ones. This illusion occurs constantly, not just in casinos. If your lucky number has not come up in a long time, you may bet more on it, thinking that you already owe it to yourself. If your favorite team has lost 5 games in a row, you may believe that it is destined to win the next, even if nothing has changed in its chances. The mind cannot avoid looking for patterns, even in randomness. It is comforting to think that there is order, a kind of justice in chaos. But randomness doesn't work that way. There is no invisible scorer who makes sure things stay balanced. That the roulette falls 5 times on red does not make it more likely to fall on red next time. It's still just chance. The fallacy deceives you by making you believe that nature owes you something, as if luck has memory, as if the universe is going to fix things if you wait long enough. The danger is that it feeds the risk. You double the bets, make irrational decisions, chase losses, all because you believe the next result is predetermined. But the universe does not keep accounts. It just rolls the dice. Recognizing the gambler's fallacy does not stop bad luck, but prevents you from turning it into worse decisions. Your memory has a strange preference. It tends to cling more to the last thing you've heard or seen. It is the recency effect. When given a list of items, you're more likely to remember the last ones better than those in the middle. And it's not just lists. Think of conversations, presentations, or discussions. People often remember your last words more than anything else you've said. If a movie has a great ending, it can redeem a boring beginning. If a speech ends on a striking note, then everything seems more impressive than it is. This bias also manifests in everyday decisions. When you decide what to eat, the last restaurant someone mentioned may stay more engraved in your mind than previous suggestions. In job interviews, the last candidate may seem more impressive simply because they are fresh in your memory. If you watch videos compulsively, you may feel more influenced by the last one you saw, even if it was not the most informative. And when you reflect on your day, the way it ended, whether calmly or stressfully, can influence how you feel about the whole. The recency effect occurs because short-term memory is like a spotlight. The last thing that has entered it is still shining, is still vivid, is still resonating in your mind. But this means your perception of reality can be distorted easily. You can overvalue something just because it was last, not because it was really the best or most important. Understanding the recency effect is like catching your mind in the act of favoring things. It reminds you that the most recent is not always the truest, and that to see clearly, you sometimes have to step back and remember the big picture, not just the last frame. The first thing you hear usually stays with you the most. That is the primacy effect. Your mind gives more importance to what appears first, even if it is not most accurate or important. Imagine that you are reading a list of names. You are much more likely to remember the first ones than those in the middle. Or think about when someone describes a person to you. If he starts by saying, "He is very intelligent," your brain forms a positive impression from the start, and everything you hear afterwards tends to fit into that narrative. But if he starts by saying, "He is a bit difficult," all your perception changes. Even if the rest of the description is complimentary, this bias manifests in discussions, first impressions, marketing, and even job interviews. The first step sets the tone. In a debate, whoever speaks first often sets the tone. In school, if the first class of subject is exciting or boring, it can shape your opinion about the entire subject. That is why headlines are important. That is why the first brands you hear are the ones that inspire the most confidence in you. Even when the quality is not better, the primacy effect remains not only in memory. It influences your judgment. First impressions are not just lasting. They are so lasting that they can override later information. You could meet someone who gives you a bad first impression, then shows you that they are kind and trustworthy. But that first impression will still be there, subtly influencing your opinion. Your brain likes shortcuts. It tells you, let's build the foundations with the first thing we hear. And often it does not even bother to rebuild them, even if better information appears. The result is a bias that seems completely natural, but silently distorts the way you perceive, remember, and decide, simply because something came first. You do not know how little you know, and that is the Dunning-Kruger effect. It is a bias where people with little skill in a given area overestimate their skills or knowledge. It does not mean that they are arrogant or intentionally trying to deceive. It means that they sincerely believe they understand something better than they actually do. And the reason's simple. The same skills that help you perform well are those you need to recognize what is good. Therefore, when you lack those skills, you also lack the ability to realize your limitations. This is seen all the time. A beginner who has just learned some buzzwords in psychology suddenly acts like an expert on human behavior. Someone who has watched a few YouTube videos about nutrition gives bold advice on diets with total confidence. And perhaps you yourself have had the experience of starting something new and feeling that you have everything under control, only to realize later how complex it really is. Interestingly, the opposite also holds true. Highly competent people tend to underestimate themselves because the more they learn, the more aware they become of everything they do not know. Thus, while the less qualified often feel overconfident, the more qualified may feel insecure. That discrepancy creates a strange social tension. People with the loudest voices and most confidence are not always those with the most insight. And those with deeper knowledge may hesitate to speak, unsure if they are truly qualified. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not limited to knowledge. It can be applied to any skill, such as driving, writing, public speaking, and even self-awareness. And it is not something overcome with age. In fact, you could be under its spell right now without even realizing it. That is what makes it powerful. The real danger is not just being wrong. It is being wrong while convinced that you are right. Humility, curiosity, and a willingness to be wrong are the best antidotes. The moment you ask yourself, "What am I missing?" you've taken a step out of the illusion. After something happens, it seems suddenly obvious. You look back and say, "I knew that would happen." Although at that moment you probably did not know it. That is retrospective bias, a mental illusion that makes events seem more predictable than they were. Once you know the result, your brain rewrites the story, smoothing out uncertainty and making it seem like you saw it coming from the start. This is seen in everything from sports games to stock market crashes or historical events. When a team loses, fans say that the signs were clear. After a crisis, people point out warning signs that supposedly everyone overlooked. But before it happened, those same signs were hidden in noise, surrounded by many other possibilities. Retrospective bias distorts the way we learn from experience. It makes us overconfident in our judgment and unfairly critical of others who should have known better. We blame decision-makers for not anticipating things that only seem clear in hindsight. Bias also changes the way that we see ourselves. You may look back and think about a failed relationship or bad investment and think, "I should have known," without realizing that your current perspective colors your memory of the past. Then, it wasn't obvious. If it had been, you would have acted differently. But your mind edits the past to fit what you now know, creating a false sense of clarity. This illusion can be comforting because it makes the world seem more orderly and understandable. But it's also dangerous. It prevents us from being humble about the limits of our foresight. It makes it harder to forgive mistakes, both our own and others. And it turns the chaotic and uncertain present into an orderly and predictable past that never existed. You probably think that you are better than average. Most people believe it. Smarter than average, kinder, more self-aware, more capable. But statistically, we cannot all be above average simultaneously. That is the illusion of illusory superiority, a mental bias by which people consistently overestimate their own qualities compared with those of others. That is why almost everyone believes they are above average drivers, even though, by definition, half of the people on a road have to be below average. That is why students rate themselves as more ethical, smarter, and harder working than their peers. And that is why people often believe they are less biased than others. This illusion is not just fun. It shapes our behavior. It makes us underestimate how much we still have to learn. It leads us to judge others more harshly while giving ourselves a benefit of the doubt. It deceives us into believing that we are more rational, open-minded, or insightful than the people we argue with. And since this belief makes us feel good, we rarely stop questioning it. Illusory superiority also manifests in relationships and the workplace. You may think you contribute more to a group project than your peers or are a better communicator than your partner, even when they disagree. In conflicts, this leads to a frustrating cycle. Both sides feel morally superior. Both think the other is the problem, and both are convinced that they're more reasonable. The funny thing is that this illusion can coexist with insecurity. You may feel insecure about certain things, but deep down you still believe that, in general, you're better than most people. This is because superiority doesn't always come from confidence. It often comes from comparing ourselves with others. And when we compare ourselves to others, we tend to focus on their visible flaws and our own invisible intentions. The illusion of being above average isn't necessarily bad. It can increase motivation, help us recover from setbacks, and give us a sense of control. But when we take it too far, it becomes a blind spot. It prevents us from growing, listening, and understanding. And sometimes the most superior thing you can do is admit that you are not. You hear success stories of entrepreneurs who have earned millions, of people who dropped out of school and became famous, of artists who struggled for years and finally succeeded. And that makes you think, if they could, so can I. But what you don't hear about is the thousands of people who followed the same path, worked just as hard, and failed silently. That is survival bias. It is the illusion that success is more common than it really is, simply because failures don't make the news. We celebrate the companies that survived the market, the planes that reached their destination, the diets that worked, the strategies that led to victory. But we rarely see the whole picture. The stories that survive tend to be the exception, not the rule. During the Second World War, analysts wanted to reinforce the planes in which they found bullet holes, until a statistician pointed out that those were the planes that were returning. Those that were shot in other parts never returned. That idea, realizing what is missing from the data, is the key to overcoming survival bias. It affects everything from investment to health advice and motivation. People say, follow your passion. It worked for Steve Jobs, without taking into account how many passionate people did not make it. We love the before and after photos, but we ignore the people who tried the same thing and saw no change. Survival bias turns anecdotes into evidence and inspiration into distortion. It makes success seem easy and failure a personal defect, rather than part of a broader invisible trend. The problem is not being inspired by those who achieved it. It is forgetting how many did not achieve it. Survival bias not only makes us too confident, it also makes us unfair, because we judge the results without seeing the hidden costs, the untold failures, and the people who took the same leap but never landed. To truly understand success, you have to listen to the silence, the voices that fail to arrive. The way something is presented can completely change your opinion about it, even if the facts remain the same. That is the framing effect. Imagine that you are told that a medical procedure has a 90% survival rate. Sounds reassuring, right? But now imagine that you are told that it has a 10% mortality rate. Suddenly, it seems riskier. Although both statements mean exactly the same thing, the information has not changed, only the way it has been framed. And that subtle difference in wording can change decisions, emotions, and beliefs in a very powerful way. Framing determines how we think about risks, rewards, and responsibilities. A politician says he is going to cut taxes instead of reducing public services. A company announces that a product has 95% less fat instead of 5% fat. A charity tells you that you can save a life instead of saying someone could die if you don't donate. Each version pushes your mind in a different direction. One is positive, the other negative. One gives hope, the other gives fear. And often we don't even realize that we have been influenced. We simply believe that we are making a rational decision. This effect not only influences marketing or the media, it affects how we judge people, make financial decisions, and even vote. When a problem is posed as a potential loss, we become more cautious or even irrationally fearful. When it is posed as a gain, we tend to take more risks or feel more optimistic. And the scariest thing is that we can be manipulated simply by the way a question is formulated, how an option is described, or even how a story is told. The framing effect reveals how fragile objectivity can be. It doesn't just matter what you are told, but how it's told. And once you start to realize, you will see it everywhere, in the headlines, in the debates, in the advertisements, and even in your own thoughts. Your brain craves meaning and clarity, but it is surprisingly easy to manipulate it without changing a single fact. You're more likely to believe, buy, or support something simply because other people do. That is the bandwagon effect. It is the psychological appeal of popularity. When a trend starts to gain momentum, when a belief seems widely accepted, or When a product starts flying off the shelves, something in your mind silently whispers, maybe they know something I don't know. You may not even like it at first, but as more people join, your resistance starts to fade. Suddenly, the music sounds better, the movie seems more interesting, and the opinion seems more accurate. Just because it's everywhere. The bandwagon effect is not limited to passing fads. It influences elections, stock markets, and social movements. People vote for candidates they think are going to win. Invest in companies because everyone else does. Change your mind to adapt to the loudest voices, not necessarily the most thoughtful ones. This can create feedback loops in which beliefs become assumed truths, not because they are correct, but because they are repeated. And here is the twist. We often don't realize we're doing it. We tell ourselves that we are making informed and independent decisions. But the truth is that popularity is persuasive. When something is widely accepted, it acquires an aura of legitimacy, even if it started as a mistake, a marketing trick, or a misunderstanding. Sometimes the crowd is right, but not always. The bandwagon effect does not ask if something is good, true, or meaningful. It simply rewards what is popular. In a world of trends, algorithms, and virality, the hardest thing is to take a step back and ask yourself, do I really believe in this, or am I just getting carried away? You have already spent the money, you have already invested the time, you have already dedicated your energy, and now, even though it is clear that it does not work, you do not want to abandon it. That is the sunk cost fallacy. It is the feeling that, since you have invested so much, you have to keep going, even if it no longer makes sense. Maybe it's a movie that bores you after 30 minutes, but you tell yourself, I've already paid for the ticket. Or a relationship that has been painful for years, but you think, I have already invested so much in this. Or a business idea that is losing money, but you say, we can't stop now. We've come too far. The truth is that those past investments, your time, your money, your emotional effort, have been lost. They are what economists call sunk costs and cannot be recovered. But your brain doesn't want to admit it. It treats those losses as a debt that can still be paid if you keep trying a little harder. The problem is that, by clinging to the past, you run the risk of wasting even more of your future. The longer you remain trapped in a bad decision, the more you will lose because you're trying to justify something that cannot be undone. What makes the sunk cost fallacy especially dangerous is how emotional it is. It's not just about logic. It's about pride, fear, and hope. Walking away can feel like failure. It may seem like you are admitting that you were wrong, but in reality, it is often the smartest and bravest decision you can make. The real question is not how much you have spent, but what you would choose if you were starting from scratch right now. That question ends the illusion and returns you to clarity. Letting go is not giving up. It is choosing wisely. It is refusing to dedicate more to something just because you already have. And sometimes that's the most difficult and liberating decision of all. You think something will take an hour and somehow end up taking 3. You are not lazy or have planned badly on purpose, but your brain has tricked you into believing things would go better than they have. That is the planning fallacy. It is the mental habit of underestimating how long a task will take, even when you have done similar tasks before and should know better. You can promise to finish a project for the weekend, start packing for a trip the night before, or think you can renovate a room in just days. And when it takes twice as long, you are surprised, even though the same thing always happens. The strange thing is that the planning fallacy usually does not disappear with experience. Even if you have failed 100 times with deadlines, your brain still leans towards the optimistic estimation. Why? Because you tend to imagine the ideal version of how things will go without interruptions, setbacks, or the random chaos of real life. You focus on the task itself, not on all the invisible steps surrounding it. The emails you will have to answer, unexpected problems, and the loss of motivation halfway through. In your mind, everything flows smoothly. In reality, everything is delayed. The situation worsens in group environments, teams, committees, or companies that make big plans with ambitious deadlines, and everyone agrees. Partly because optimism feels good, and partly because nobody wants to be the spoilsport who says, actually, this could take twice as long. So budgets are broken, deadlines missed, and people rush to recover lost time at the last moment, and the cycle repeats. The planning fallacy reveals how deep our desire to believe we are in control is. It is comforting to think we will meet the schedule, work efficiently, and that the future is predictable. But being realistic is not pessimism. It is wisdom. Every time we ignore the past and expect the best case, we expose ourselves to stress, disappointment, and unfinished plans. The trick is not to stop making plans. It is to incorporate the delays, distractions, and detours that you already know are coming. When things go well, you take credit. When they go wrong, you blame something else. It is the self-serving bias, and almost everyone has it. If you get an excellent grade on an exam, it is because you were smart or studied hard. If you fail, well, the questions were unfair, you were tired, or the teacher did not explain things well. In sports, if your team wins, it is because you played very well. If your team loses, it is because the referee made terrible decisions. This bias protects your self-esteem. It is a way to keep your sense of identity intact. You build a version of reality in which you are always the hero, or at least never the villain. The selfish bias not only affects how you explain events to others, it changes your way of interpreting reality. It feels good to believe that you are in control when things are going well. It feels even better to believe external forces are to blame when they are not. It is not about lying. It is about the mind choosing the story that makes you feel better. And it is a story that we tell ourselves constantly, often without realizing it. I got the promotion because I earned it, but I didn't get it because the manager has favorites. Or that relationship ended because they were difficult, not because maybe I also had something to work on. The danger of the selfish bias is that it can hinder growth. If you're never to blame, you never need to change. If you always take credit for success, you may overlook the role of luck, timing, or support from others. Over time, it can lead to arrogance, blaming others, and fragile self-esteem that crumbles as soon as reality does not cooperate. But the truth is that life's complicated. Sometimes you do everything right and still fail. Sometimes you screw up and keep winning. Seeing things clearly without always protecting your ego is not easy, but it is one of the most powerful steps towards true self-awareness. When someone has an impressive quality, such as being attractive, self-confident, or successful, you tend to assume that they have many other positive traits, even if there is no reason to think so. That is the halo effect. It's as if a bright light in someone's personality prevents you from seeing everything else. If someone is charming, you may also think they are intelligent. If they dress well, you might assume they are competent. If they speak confidently, you can take their opinions more seriously, even if they are completely wrong. This bias affects how we hire people, how we vote, who we trust, and even who we fall in love with. Celebrities get away with behaving badly because their public image shines so brightly. A teacher who is nice can get better grades from students regardless of whether they actually teach well. The opposite also holds true. If you dislike someone once, their entire character may seem darker than it really is. This is called the horn effect, but it's just the same illusion in reverse. The halo effect not only determines how we judge others, it also influences how we see ourselves. If you're good at something, you may overestimate your abilities in areas that you have not even tried. You may assume that, since you're successful in your career, your opinions on politics or relationships must also be correct. The reality is that different traits do not always go together. Being good at one thing does not guarantee being good at another. But your brain wants to simplify the image. It wants people to be good or bad, not a mixture. Therefore, it fills in the blanks and often gets it wrong. The halo effect is comforting because it makes the world seem more predictable, but also leads to hasty judgments, missed opportunities, and unfair advantages. Someone with substance can go unnoticed because they don't shine immediately. And someone with style but little depth can inspire more confidence than they should. The truth is that people are complex. A good trait does not mean that everything else is brilliant, but the shine is hard to resist. You look at something at random and see a pattern that doesn't really exist. That is the clustering illusion. It is your brain looking for order in chaos, to connect the dots even when they are not meant to be connected. If you flip a coin 5 times and it comes up heads each time, you may feel that it now has to come up tails, as if there is a hidden balance trying to balance itself. Or if you see 3 people in a row wearing red shirts, you may wonder if something is happening, even if it is just a coincidence. We are uncomfortable with randomness, so we try to impose meaning on it. This illusion is the reason why gamblers think certain slot machines are hot, why people feel lucky or cursed, and why conspiracy theories can seem so convincing. Random events begin to look like deliberate patterns. The death of several celebrities in a short time becomes a curse of celebrities. A group of diseases awakens the fear of a hidden cause. But in reality, randomness clusters, like raindrops on the windshield or stars in the sky. Things that are randomly scattered often end up forming clusters by chance. The clustering illusion deceives us and makes us see meaning where there is none. And once we notice an alleged pattern, our brain begins to reinforce it. We remember the times it was fulfilled and ignore the times it was not. It is comforting to think that things happen for a reason, that chaos has a secret structure, but chance owes us no explanation. Sometimes things cluster for no reason at all. And the most difficult thing is to accept that there is no deeper meaning behind it, only coincidence and the relentless impulse of the mind to find patterns in the noise. You tend to judge others more harshly than yourself, especially when they make mistakes. That is called the fundamental attribution error. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you assume it is a selfish or reckless person. But when you cut someone off, it is because you were late, distracted, or simply had a bad day. The same mistake, 2 very different stories. You see their actions as a reflection of their character, but yours as a response to the situation. This happens all the time. If a coworker does not meet a deadline, you may think that they are lazy or incompetent. But if you do not meet it, it is for a valid reason. Too many meetings, unexpected problems, a tight schedule. You give yourself the benefit of the doubt, but you do not always give it to others. And the closer someone is to you, whether family or friends, the more generous you can be. But with strangers, hasty judgments tend to endure. The most surprising thing is that everyone does this to others. We judge another person's character based on limited information, while they do the same to us. The result is a world full of misunderstandings. People constantly misunderstand each other, assume the worst, and rarely stop to ask what else might be happening. The truth is that most people only react to the pressures around them the same way you do. But the fundamental attribution error keeps us trapped in a loop where we blame people instead of the context. And in doing so, we lose sight of the big picture. Bad things stay with you more than good ones. That is the essence of negative bias. You can receive 10 compliments in a day, but if one person insults you, that is the one you remember. It is not just an emotional peculiarity. It is a deeply rooted survival mechanism. For most of human history, detecting danger was much more important than enjoying comfort. If you missed a beautiful sunset, nothing happened. If you did not see a predator among the bushes, you died. Therefore, our brain evolved to prioritize everything that seems threatening, painful, or unpleasant. Negative bias manifests itself everywhere, in how we judge people, remember events, or make decisions. A single uncomfortable moment at a party can make you feel like the whole night was a failure. You could get a 95% on an exam and still be obsessed with the only question you failed. When you read reviews, your eyes go directly to the 1-star comments, even if the rest are positive. Politicians know this bias well, which is why fear-based messages work so well. The media also understand it. Stories about disasters, scandals, and tragedies dominate the headlines, not because the world is getting worse, but because that is what captures our attention. This bias even affects relationships. You may feel more hurt by a sarcastic comment from your partner than encouraged by weeks of kindness. Negative emotions are stronger, more persistent, and heavier. They take over your mind more quickly and disappear more slowly. It is not that positive things do not matter. They do matter, but they have to work harder to be noticed, remembered, and believed. Recognizing negative bias does not mean ignoring the bad. It just means learning not to let it define your entire perception. The mind is like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. But if you're aware of it, you can start to balance the scales. When faced with a story or a specific detail, you tend to ignore the big picture, the real statistics that matter. That is base rate neglect. Imagine someone tells you about a quiet, studious boy who loves libraries and wears glasses. Then they ask you, is it more likely that he is a truck driver or a librarian? Most people say librarian because the description resembles that of a librarian. But the truth is that there are far more truck drivers than librarians. Statistically, it is much more likely that he is a truck driver, even if the details do not fit the stereotype. The base rate neglect occurs when we forget how common or rare something is within the general population. We get carried away by the vividness of a story or how representative a person or situation seems and set aside the real figures. You may hear about a charismatic young man who dropped out of college, started a company in his garage, and found resounding success. It sounds like a classic success story of genius. So when someone drops out of school to pursue their dream, you might think they could be the next Steve Jobs, but you're ignoring the base rate, the overwhelming number of people who try the same thing and fail. The odds aren't magically better just because the story is familiar. This bias appears in hiring, news, politics, anywhere we weigh decisions based on descriptions rather than probabilities. If someone seems suitable for a position, we may overlook their actual qualifications or how many similar people have succeeded or failed previously. We like the story more than the statistics. The base rate neglect seems intuitive, but it leads to poor decisions. We focus on the anecdote rather than any trend. We believe in the exceptional case rather than everyday reality. And we forget that what usually happens matters more than what seems like it could happen. To think more clearly, we must look beyond the story, consider the real figures, and remember that a good story does not always equal a likely outcome. You are more likely to believe something is true simply because an authority figure said it. That is the authority bias. When someone wears a lab coat, speaks confidently, or has a fancy title, your brain gives their words more weight. Even if what they say does not hold up under scrutiny, it isn't always about credentials. It can be a boss, a father, a teacher, or a celebrity, even someone who seems to know what they're talking about. The moment they assume that role, your critical thinking takes a step back. This bias manifests in surprisingly automatic ways. If a doctor gives a diagnosis, most people accept it without asking for a second opinion, even when the symptoms don't quite match. If a headline begins with "experts say," we are more likely to agree even before we read the details. In marketing, it is why companies use actors dressed as professionals or cite vague studies to help sell products. That's why people fall for scams where someone poses as the IRS or police. They're taking advantage of our instinct to obey a perceived authority. The authority bias can be useful in many situations. Trusting experts saves time and energy, but it becomes dangerous when automatic. When we submit to authority without asking questions, or when we silence our own judgment because they must know better. History is full of examples in which bad decisions were made only because someone in authority ordered them. People ignored their own discomfort, their own logic, because the person giving instructions was wearing a badge, clipboard, or title. The real challenge is to find a balance. Respecting knowledge without giving up the ability to think, because authority does not guarantee truth. Sometimes the most valuable ideas come from questioning the very people we have been taught to never doubt. You probably feel that doing nothing is safer than doing something, even if the result is the same or worse. That is the omission bias, the mental shortcut by which inaction seems less harmful and less guilt-inducing than action. If a doctor administers a treatment that causes harm, people tend to blame them more than if they had done nothing and the harm occurred anyway, even when the outcome is identical. It is as if not acting makes you less responsible, even though the decision not to intervene is still a choice. This bias manifests in everyday life in subtle ways. You may avoid giving your honest opinion for fear of hurting someone's feelings. even if your silence allows a negative situation to continue. Perhaps you do not vote, thinking that your inaction is neutral, even though that inaction still contributes to the outcome. In relationships, it is easier to avoid difficult conversations, let things go, and hope that problems resolve themselves. But evasion has consequences, and omission isn't neutral. It is just quieter. What makes the omission bias so powerful is that it seems like a moral safety net. Acting carries visible consequences and a possible feeling of guilt. Inaction allows you to hide behind an illusion of innocence. You have not caused the damage. You have only let it happen. But deep down, a part of you knows that turning your back is still a form of participation. Not choosing anything is still a choice. The omission bias can be comforting, but can also make injustice, conflicts, and errors persist longer than they should. It tempts you to keep your hands clean at the cost of allowing something bad to continue. Sometimes doing nothing is the riskiest decision of all. When someone else makes a mistake, you tend to blame their personality. He is careless, lazy, selfish, or simply does not try hard enough. But when you screw up, the story changes. You blame the situation. You were tired, distracted, under pressure, or dealing with things that others do not see. That is the actor-observer bias, and it is one of the most common distortions in the way we judge behavior, our own and that of others. It works like this. When you're the actor in a situation, you see all the context surrounding your actions. You know what led you to make that decision, what your intentions were, and what pressures you were under. But when you are the observer, especially if someone you do not know well, you only see the action itself. If someone cuts you off in traffic, he is an idiot. But when you do it, it is only because you are late, nervous, or have not seen it. If a friend forgets your birthday, he is selfish. But when you forget theirs, it is because you are overwhelmed. This bias does not arise from malice. It comes from perspective. You live inside your own head, surrounded by your reasons and your justifications, but you do not live inside that of others. Therefore, when you look at them from the outside, it is easy to forget that their world is as complicated as yours. The actor-observer bias creates a double standard in the way we assign blame and can quietly erode relationships. It makes you more forgiving of yourself than of others. And that imbalance, over time, can lead to resentment, misunderstandings, and the illusion that you are being fair when you're not really. But once you know it exists, you can start to slow down. Instead of thinking that they are like that, because they're like that, you can pause and ask yourself what is happening with them. It is not about excusing everything. It is about remembering that people, like you, are usually more than they seem at any given moment. You assume that others think, feel, and see the world in the same way that you do. And that is the projection bias. It is the mental shortcut by which you take your current thoughts, values, or emotional state and project them onto others, expecting them to react the same way you do. If you're excited about something, you may assume that everyone else will be too. If you're anxious or frustrated, you can interpret someone else's silence as anger or disapproval, even if they are just tired or distracted. You treat your internal state as if it were everyone else's default state. This also manifests in planning and decision-making. When you are calm and satisfied, it is difficult to imagine what you will want when you are stressed or hungry. You may underestimate how much food you will need, how tired you will feel tomorrow, or how difficult a future task will be, because you're projecting your current self onto your future self. You assume that you are consistent when, in reality, your mind is constantly changing. The projection bias distorts empathy. You may think you're being understanding when, in reality, you're just imagining how you would feel in their situation. But their background, their temperament, and their way of thinking may be completely different. When someone reacts in a way that does not make sense to you, it may seem irrational. Not because it is, but because your default lens cannot explain it. You can miss what they are really experiencing because you're too busy seeing yourself in their place. It also affects relationships. You may believe that someone is angry with you just because you feel insecure, or you can give a gift that you would love and be surprised when they are not impressed. You can argue passionately about a topic and assume that anyone who disagrees must be uninformed or wrong. Because if you were in their place, you'd agree. That is the pitfall. confusing your perspective with universal truth. The more aware we are of projection bias, the more we can stop and ask ourselves, is it really about them, or is it about me? That small question can change how we relate, plan our lives, and even think about the world. Because understanding another person does not begin by imagining how you would feel. It begins by recognizing that you aren't them. You tend to believe things will go better for you than others, even when there's no reason to think so. That is the optimistic bias, and it silently colors your expectations without asking permission. That is why you can assume that you will live longer than average, that you will avoid serious illnesses, that you will be successful in your career, or that you will maintain a happy marriage, while you think that other people will probably not be so lucky. Even if you know the statistics, you believe you'll beat the odds. You believe that your car will not have an accident, that your plans will go well, and that your future will unfold exactly as you've imagined. This bias is part of what makes people move forward. It fuels ambition, perseverance, and willingness to take risks. If we saw reality with total precision, perhaps we would be paralyzed by uncertainty or fear and could not act. The optimistic bias whispers in your ear that everything will be fine. And sometimes that is exactly what you need to hear to move forward. But it also has a downside. It can lead to overconfidence, poor planning, and ignoring warning signs. You could underestimate the time a project will take, dispense with insurance, delay a medical checkup, or avoid saving money because you believe, deep down, that everything will be fine. The optimistic bias isn't limited to big life decisions. It also manifests in everyday decisions. I will remember it without writing it down. This shortcut will not make me get lost, or I probably will not get caught. It convinces you that you are the exception, that your good luck will continue forever, that misfortune happens to others. But here's the catch. Most people think like that. So, in a strange way, we are all excessively optimistic together. Each of us assumes that he is the lucky one. And yet, many of us manage to get through life relatively well. In part because this bias helps us maintain hope, resilience, and motivation. The danger is not optimism itself. It is optimism without control, optimism without preparation. Believing that things will go well is powerful, but preparing in case they don't is wisdom. You tend to expect things to turn out worse than they probably will. That is the pessimistic bias. The tendency to overestimate the probability of negative outcomes occurring and to see future events through a darker, more distressing lens than reality warrants. It makes you assume that things will fall apart, that people will disappoint you, or that trying something new will end in failure. Even when there is no real reason to be so skeptical, your brain whispers to you, it probably won't go well, just in case. This bias may come from past experiences, especially painful ones. If you have been disappointed before, your mind tries to protect you by preparing you for the worst. But that protection often comes at a cost. Missed opportunities, constant stress, and a biased view of life. You may hesitate to apply for a job because you take it for granted that you will not get it. You may avoid relationships because you're convinced that they will end up hurting you. You may see that the world is getting worse, even when certain things are statistically improving, such as poverty, health, or violence, because bad news seems more credible than good news. The pessimistic bias does not only affect individuals. It shapes public opinion, politics, and culture. A single failure is remembered more clearly than 10 quiet successes. Predictions of disasters draw more attention than slow, steady progress. The media know this. That is why headlines tend to be negative. Fear spreads more quickly than hope. And once that perspective takes hold, it reinforces itself. If you expect the worst, you might stop trying. And by stopping trying, you increase your chances of failure, thus fulfilling the initial fear. But this is what makes this bias complicated. It seems realistic. It seems intelligent to assume things will go wrong. After all, life can be hard. But the pessimistic bias is not realism. It is a distorted filter that makes you underestimate your possibilities, despise the good in the world, and overlook your own resilience. Being cautious is sensible, but expecting the worst all the time is just an illusion. You remember something in one way, But it turns out it never happened that way. And somehow, many people remember it the same way, erroneously. That is the Mandela Effect. Its name comes from a strange moment in which many people swore they remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, when in reality, he lived until 2013. It was not just a vague memory. They remembered the news coverage, the public mourning, even school lessons about it. But none of that ever happened. And that is not all. Perhaps you remembered the Monopoly man having a monocle. That is not the case. Or maybe you were sure that Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father." But the real phrase is simply, "No, I am your father." It is not just about typographical errors or slips. They are complete and certain memories of something that never existed, often shared by thousands or even millions of people. What makes the Mandela Effect so fascinating is that it challenges your perception of how solid and reliable memory is. It gives the feeling that your memory is like a video recording that you can rewind and play. But that is not the case. Memory is more like a story that your brain recreates each time you remember it, filling in gaps, making assumptions, and smoothing out details. And since human brains tend to work similarly, they often make similar mistakes. The result is collective false memories that seem absolutely real. Some people even go further and wonder if these failures are proof of alternative realities, parallel timelines, or changes to the structure of the universe. Whether you believe in it or not, the Mandela Effect reminds us that not even your most vivid memories are immune to distortion. You can be completely sure of something that simply never happened, and you will not be alone. You remember something so clearly that you would bet money on it. But it turns out you are wrong about the origin of that memory. That is a misattribution of memory. It happens when your brain confuses details. You remember the fact, the face, or the event, but you relate it to the wrong time, place, or person. You can confidently tell a story that you think happened to you, when in reality, it happened to someone else. Or remember a great idea you had, without realizing that you actually heard it from a friend or read it in a book years ago. What makes this bias so powerful is that it is not perceived as an error. The memory seems as real as the true ones. Your brain fills in gaps without asking permission, joining fragments of experiences to create a story that seems correct, even if it is not. You can swear that you saw a certain movie when you were a child, but the movie premiered when you were already an adult. You can remember a conversation that never happened simply because you imagined it so intensely. The erroneous attribution can even render the testimony of an eyewitness dangerously unreliable. Someone can sincerely believe that they saw a person at the scene of a crime when what they really saw was that person's photo on television the day before. The brain is not a recording device. It is a narrator. And, like any narrator, it becomes creative. It borrows fragments of dreams, books, conversations overheard by chance, emotions, and assumptions, and weaves them into a tapestry that we call memory. The erroneous attribution reminds us that even our most precious and vivid memories are not immune to error. They are reconstructions, not reproductions. And that means that every time we remember something, we are not only accessing the past, we are also rewriting it slightly. If you want to remember something for a long time, it is not enough to study it once. And, curiously, repeating it over and over again in a single session is not the best strategy either. What really works best is spacing it out, reviewing the material over time, with breaks in between. This is known as the spacing effect, and it is one of the most reliable findings of cognitive psychology. Your brain does not only remember based on repetition. It remembers based on how that repetition is programmed. When you study by heart, your brain retains the information in short-term memory, only long enough to pass an exam or finish a task. But without space between learning sessions, your brain has no need to encode it in depth. It treats the information as something disposable. But when you return to the same idea after a while, when your brain has almost begun to forget it, it has to work a little harder to recover it. And that effort reinforces the memory. The more times you recover it with longer intervals between each attempt, the more solidly it will be fixed in long-term memory. It is counterintuitive because spacing learning seems slower. You may forget something between sessions, and that seems like a failure to you, but that forgetting is part of the process. It forces your brain to re-engage, to reconfigure itself, to restore the idea more deeply. Therefore, learning a new language, mastering a skill, or studying something meaningful works best when it is distributed over days, weeks, or even months. You could study for 5 hours today and remember almost nothing within a week. Or you could study 1 hour a day for 5 days and remember it for life. The spacing effect teaches us that learning is not just a matter of effort. It is a matter of time. The brain learns better not when it is flooded with information, but when it is gently reminded again and again just before it is forgotten. When you look back and remember an experience, you do not remember it all equally. You remember how you felt at the peak moment and how it ended. That is the peak end rule. Your brain does not take the average of every moment. It focuses on the most intense part and on the final part, and uses those two moments to judge the entire event. Therefore, a vacation with a magical night can seem incredible in retrospect, even if most of the trip was simply acceptable. It is also the reason why a good movie with a disappointing ending can seem like a bad movie overall, even if most of it was enjoyable. This rule determines how we remember relationships, jobs, meals, concerts, almost anything that has a beginning, a development, and an end. A painful experience, such as a medical intervention, can be remembered as less unpleasant if the final moments were gentle, even if the overall pain was worse. Similarly, a party that goes on too long can leave a bad taste, even if most of it was fun. Our memories are not fair. They are summaries of the highlights with a biased montage. We forget the boring parts of the middle and exaggerate the high or low emotional moments. And this not only affects how we remember things, it affects the decisions we make in the future. You may return to a restaurant for an incredible dessert, even if the rest of the food was mediocre. Or you may avoid something completely because of how badly it ended, even if overall it was good. The peak end rule teaches us that memory and experience are not the same. What we live and what we carry onward are different. And sometimes all that is needed to change how something is remembered is a powerful moment or a better ending. You remember exactly where you were, what you did, and with whom. The moment something impactful happened, good or bad, it was recorded in your mind like a photograph. That is what is known as a flashbulb memory. They are vivid, emotionally charged memories that seem permanently etched in your brain. People often describe them with total certainty. I remember every detail, they say, as if it happened yesterday. The day a loved one passed, the moment they heard news that changed the world, the instant they fell in love or felt heartbreak. It is as if time stopped and their memory captured the scene forever. But here is the twist. Although these memories seem very clear, they are often inaccurate. Studies show that, over time, people's flashbulb memories change and become distorted, even though their confidence remains high. The brain does not store memories like photographs. It reconstructs them piece by piece each time you remember them. That means every time you relive that intense moment, your brain can slightly reshape it without you realizing. You're not only remembering, but rewriting. So, why do flashbulb memories seem so real? Because emotion enhances the memory. When something seems huge, your brain pays close attention to it. But attention is not synonymous with precision. It just means that moment is labeled as important. You clearly remember the emotion, the shock, the fear, the joy. But the facts, not so much. Your mind fills in gaps with guesses, assumptions, or fragments taken from other memories. Flashbulb memories remind us that certainty and truth are not always the same. You may be sure, but that does not mean your memory is faithful. And yet, these memories often shape who we are, how we see the world, and how we tell our stories. They are emotional milestones in the landscape of your life. Even if the map is not entirely accurate, you tend to remember the past better than it was. That is optimistic hindsight, a bias in which your mind softens the difficult parts of past experiences and highlights the good ones. You look back on your high school years and forget the awkwardness, the anxiety, the boring classes, and instead remember the laughter, the friends, the feeling of possibility. A vacation that at the time seemed exhausting becomes something relaxing and magical in your memory. A relationship that ended for good reasons begins to seem, in retrospect, something you lost instead of something you escaped. It is not just nostalgia. It is a kind of mental editing. Your brain does not store events like a camera. It stores impressions, emotions, and highlights. And when you look back, especially when life seems uncertain or stressful, your mind unconsciously seeks comforting memories. The past begins to seem like a golden age, even if it was full of the same difficulties, doubts, and frustrations you deal with now. The further an experience goes back, the easier it is for the negative aspects to fade and the positive ones to shine more intensely. This bias can make the present seem worse by comparison. Perhaps you wonder why life seems more difficult now, or why things seemed simpler then. But it is not always because things were better. It is often because the memory has been edited so that you see it that way. The danger of optimistic hindsight is that it can keep you stuck chasing a past that never existed as you remember it. But it also has a hidden advantage. It helps you heal. Even painful moments can be remembered fondly once the sharp edges are smoothed. In a way, optimistic hindsight is your mind's way of closing the cycle, a gentle rewrite that helps you move forward. You misjudge when things happened, thinking that recent events were further back in time and distant ones more recent than they really were. It is about the telescoping effect, which silently distorts your memory like a slightly out-of-focus temporal lens. You may feel that your last vacation was only a few months ago, even though it has been more than a year. Or you may place your high school graduation closer to your childhood than it really is, even though decades have passed. Your brain compresses and stretches time in ways that do not match the calendar. The interesting thing is that this distortion isn't random. Events that are emotionally vivid or meaningful tend to seem more recent, even if they happened a long time ago. Conversely, routine or forgettable things often recede in your mind and seem more distant. You may feel that an important sentimental breakup happened yesterday because it still hurts, while last month's work meetings already seem like a blurry and distant memory. This effect is also observed in research. When people are asked when the last time they went to the doctor was, saw a movie, or attended an event, they're almost always wrong. Without realizing it, they bring past events forward and push recent ones back. The more familiar an event is, the more likely you are to place it in the wrong place on your mental timeline. It is as if your memory is not based on real dates, but on impressions, feelings, and mental shortcuts. This has to do in part with the way your brain organizes time. You don't keep a perfect mental calendar. Instead, you rely on signals, context, and your emotional connection to the memory. If those signals are strong, the event feels closer. If they are weak, it fades away, even if it was not long ago. The result is a distorted perception of the history of your own life, where moments appear and disappear based not on reality, but on relevance, emotion, and repetition. The telescoping effect is a silent reminder that your experience of time is deeply subjective. You live on a timeline of feelings, not just facts. And while clocks measure time in seconds and minutes, your memory measures it in meaning. You think that speeding up a little will save you a lot of time, but that is not how it works. That is the time-saving bias, a mental shortcut that makes you overestimate how much time you will save by going faster, especially when you're already going at a decent speed. For example, if you drive at 30 miles per hour and increase to 60, you save a lot of time. But if you're already going at 60 and go up to 70, the time saved is actually small. However, it seems huge. Your brain does not naturally grasp how time and speed interact in a nonlinear way. Therefore, it gives you the illusion that faster always means much better. This bias is not only manifested in traffic. It deceives you in your daily decisions, such as the time it takes you to complete tasks when you try to do them quickly. You may assume that working a little faster or taking some shortcuts will save you a lot of time, when in reality the gains are usually minimal and may even be counterproductive if they lead you to make mistakes or stress you out. That is why people choose high-speed internet plans that they do not need or fill their schedule assuming that they will get more productivity, only to end up feeling rushed and scattered. The time-saving bias also explains why we sometimes take unnecessary risks just to save time, such as running red lights, skipping steps in a process, or multitasking when concentrating would be faster in the long run. It makes us impatient with slower but more consistent strategies and overly optimistic with shortcuts. And yet, throughout life, it can shape your priorities, your habits, and even your health. Because chasing small imaginary gains often costs you more than it brings you. Ironically, when you slow down enough to think clearly, you often get to your destination faster. But that moment of reflection, the one that breaks the illusion, is precisely what the time-saving bias tries to make you overlook. Your brain does not like loose ends. When you start something and do not finish it, your mind keeps coming back to it, clinging to the tension until it is resolved. This is known as the Zeigarnik effect. That is why you cannot stop thinking about that email you wanted to send, the project you left unfinished, or even the end of a television episode. Pending tasks take up mental space. They remain active in your mind much longer than those you have completed. This effect was first observed when a psychologist realized that waiters could accurately remember pending accounts, but forgot them almost immediately after they were paid. The incompleteness of the task kept it alive in their memory. And it does not only happen to waiters. Your brain works the same way. The Zeigarnik effect keeps pending matters in the foreground in your mind, almost like a background process that runs until what it has started is finished. It is part of why procrastination feels so heavy. You tell yourself that you are relaxing, but what you postpone keeps calling your attention, exhausting your energy in the background. It is also a reason why making a to-do list helps. You are downloading those open loops on a paper, freeing your mind from having to retain them all at once. Even small tasks, like answering a text or finishing a conversation, can silently bother you until you finish them. Marketing specialists use this effect, too. Have you noticed how questionnaires force you to answer all but one question, then ask for your email to see the results? That tension of almost finishing forces you to move forward. Writers use it by ending chapters on a cliffhanger. Games use it with achievements that seem just out of reach. The Zeigarnik effect turns the incomplete into psychological gravity. It attracts your attention repeatedly, not because you want to, but because your mind longs to close the cycle. Your brain does not treat all information the same. When you hear a list of things, you're more likely to remember the first and the last, and to forget most of those that are in the middle. This is the serial position effect, and it shapes what you remember and what you forget. The beginning remains engraved because it is the first thing heard. You have had time to concentrate, think about it, and record it in your memory. This is called the primacy effect. The end remains engraved because it is still fresh in your mind. Perhaps only a few seconds have passed. This is the recency effect. But what is in the middle often fades away. This does not happen only with lists. Think about when you meet people at a party. You are more likely to remember the first person you talked to and the last, and you find it hard to remember the names of everyone else who is in the middle. In presentations, speeches, or debates, what is said at the beginning and at the end is what has the most impact. Politicians, advertisers, and speakers know this. That is why they put their strongest arguments at the beginning and at the end, because it is what is remembered. This effect also occurs when reading or studying. If you're reviewing cards, you will probably do better with the first and last than with those in the middle. Therefore, dividing study sessions into smaller parts, so there are more beginnings and endings, can help you retain more. The serial position effect reveals that memory is not uniform. It is more like a spotlight, bright at the edges, dim in the center. It is one of those peculiarities of the human mind that shapes our choices, conversations, and even relationships without us realizing. The more you see something, the more you like it, even if you do not quite understand why. It is the mere exposure effect. It is a silent force in your brain that equates familiarity with comfort and comfort with goodness. You may hear a song on the radio that at first seems indifferent to you, but after listening to it 5 or 10 times, you start to like it. It is not because the song has necessarily improved. It is because your brain has stopped treating it as something unknown, and that makes it safer, easier, and even more pleasant for you. This effect does not work only with music. It happens with faces, brands, foods, ideas, and even words. Advertisers use it constantly. They do not need you to love a product the first time you see it. They only need you to see it enough times so that, when it comes time to decide, it seems the most familiar option. And when something is familiar, it seems right. Even if you have never really thought about it, this simple exposure effect can shape your relationships. The people you see regularly, your classmates, your coworkers, your neighbors, begin to seem more pleasant to you over time. Not necessarily because of how they are, but simply because they have become part of your social and visual environment. This is one reason why long-distance friendships or one-off interactions often fade. The connection lacks that repeated exposure that helps feelings to grow. The most interesting thing is that this bias does not even require you to be aware. You can come to prefer symbols, sounds, or images that you scarcely notice the first time. Your conscious mind may not care, but your subconscious is always counting how often you have seen something. And it not only makes things seem better, but also makes unknown things seem worse. That is why new ideas or unfamiliar faces can cause discomfort at first. Your brain has not had time to get accustomed to them. In a world awash with content, repetition is power. That to which you are most exposed becomes that with which you feel comfortable. And what makes you feel comfortable can gradually become what you trust, what you believe, and even what you love, without realizing how little it has to do with quality and how much it has to do with the simple fact of appearing again and again. Sometimes being part of a group makes you feel so good, so safe, so united, that you stop thinking for yourself. And that is groupthink. It is when the desire for harmony and agreement within a group becomes more important than making the best decision. You do not want to be the one who disagrees, the one who slows things down, the one who creates problems. So you keep quiet. You nod your head. You convince yourself that if everyone else agrees, they must be right. But that silence is not agreement. It is fear of standing out. Group thinking can occur in boardrooms, governments, classrooms, groups of friends, and even in online communities. It is the reason why teams launch bad products, why juries make wrong decisions, why countries go to war without asking enough questions. Disagreeing seems dangerous, so it is silenced, sometimes without anyone realizing it. People begin to censor their doubts, avoid conflicts, and unite around an illusion of consensus. And once that illusion takes hold, it becomes increasingly difficult for anyone to speak up. Because now disagreeing does not only mean having a different opinion. It means threatening the unity of the group. The disturbing thing about groupthink is that the people involved are usually intelligent, thoughtful, and well-intentioned, but together they can become blind. Warnings are ignored, risks are minimized, and alternative ideas disappear. Everyone starts repeating each other, and the group moves forward with false confidence. Convinced that silence equals support, groupthink is not just about peer pressure. It is about a subtle erosion of critical thinking in the name of belonging. The group begins to feel more important than the truth. But disagreement is not disloyalty. And the best decisions often arise from tension, friction, and even uncomfortable questions. When everyone agrees too easily, it is not a sign that everything is perfect. It may be a sign that no one feels safe enough to tell the truth. You want to be seen in a good light. Whether you realize it or not, you adjust your answers, your opinions, and sometimes even your memories to look better to others. That is social desirability bias. It manifests when you answer a survey that you exercise 3 times a week, even if it is not true. That is why you say you recycle more than you actually do, or that you have never told a serious lie. In job interviews, you describe yourself as a person who works well in a team, even if you prefer working alone. On social networks, you publish the version of yourself that seems most acceptable to you. You are not exactly lying. You are acting. You are creating a version of yourself that conforms to what society rewards, even if it is not the whole truth. This bias has nothing to do with deception as we usually understand it. It is about surviving in a world where judgments are everywhere. We live in a culture of constant observation, valuations, reviews, likes, cameras, and opinions, and we have adapted by softening those parts of ourselves that could be subject to criticism. We highlight our compassion, our discipline, our virtue, and little by little, we begin to believe our own edited versions. But the price of social desirability bias is that it makes real honesty seem risky. It makes everyone seem safer, kinder, and more consistent than they really are. And that can make you feel isolated in your imperfections. You might think, everyone else seems to have it all. Why not me? The truth is that most people hide the same doubts, mistakes, and contradictions. But you don't see that. You only see the performance. And so the cycle continues. Everyone pretending for others. The social desirability bias isn't just about appearances. It is about protecting your place in the group, but ironically, it can prevent you from getting what you want most. To be understood as you are, it is natural to trust more in the people who are part of your group than in those who are not, even if the group is random, meaningless, or barely defined. It is the group bias, and it is one of the most basic and powerful forces that determine how we see others. It can be based on anything: nationality, race, religion, sports team, political party, or even something as simple as the school you attended. Once you identify with a group, you tend to see its members as more trustworthy, more intelligent, moral, and deserving, often without even realizing it. It starts early. Children assigned a red shirt in the classroom begin to favor other children with red shirts. In experiments, adults show biases towards people who share their birthday, artistic tastes, or even an invented team name. It doesn't take much. Once the line is drawn between us and them, your brain unconsciously defends your side. You forgive mistakes more easily, justify bad behaviors, and give the benefit of the doubt to those in your group. But with those outside, you are more likely to assume the worst. Group bias is not only about how we treat others. It also distorts our way of understanding justice. You may think you are objective, but when someone from your group succeeds, you see it as deserved. When someone from another group does the same, you may feel suspicion or criticism. This bias fuels tribalism, partisanship, and conflict. It makes it more difficult to collaborate between different groups, to empathize with people who are different, and to see the complete humanity in someone who does not belong to our group. The most surprising thing is that even knowing group bias exists, we are not completely protected from it. It is deep, automatic, and often invisible, like a lens that colors our vision. The challenge is to become aware of how often we favor our own and how easily that favoritism becomes exclusion, rejection, or even hatred. True impartiality means being able to see beyond the groups in which we are born or identify, and recognize that they are as complex, valuable, and real as us. You tend to think that people in your own group are unique individuals with different personalities, beliefs, and backgrounds. But people from other groups are all the same. This is the out-group homogeneity bias, and it's one of the most common mental shortcuts your brain takes. It is the belief that they're all the same, while we are diverse and complex. You can realize this when you describe people from a different culture, political party, religion, or even hobby as one-dimensional. They are extremes. They all believe in nonsense or act the same. However, you would never say that about your own group, even if you disagree with some members. This bias comes from the way your brain processes social information. You spend more time interacting with and understanding your own group. That's why you notice the subtle differences. But with the external group, you don't have as much exposure or motivation to delve deeper. So they all blend together. You create categories, and once someone is placed in one, they become a symbol of the entire group instead of a person. This is especially powerful in times of conflict or fear. If someone from an external group does something bad, your mind turns it into a pattern. They're all like that. But when someone from your inner group does the same, it's an exception. They were having a rough day. They don't represent the rest of us. This double standard feeds stereotypes, fuels prejudice, and makes it harder to see people as they are. The dangerous thing is that the homogeneity bias of the outgroup seems natural. It makes the world easier to navigate by simplifying people into defined categories. But that simplicity comes at a cost. Empathy vanishes. Curiosity shuts off. And communication breaks down. You stop seeing people. You only see labels. The truth is that all groups are made up of complicated, diverse, and contradictory people, just like you. And when you start looking beyond the surface, you realize that the line separating us is not as thick as it seems. Something strange happens when many people witness the same emergency. Nobody helps. You might think that if more people are around, there is more chance that someone will intervene. But in reality, the opposite usually occurs. It is the bystander effect. The more people there are, the less responsible each person feels. Everyone assumes that someone will do something, so nobody does anything. You could see someone faint on a busy street. Dozens of people pass by. You wait, thinking that someone has likely already asked for help. But everyone else is thinking the same. Responsibility is diluted. It doesn't seem like your problem. It seems like someone else's problem. Ironically, if you were the only person there, you would probably act immediately. But in a crowd, the action seems less urgent, less personal. That pause, that hesitation can cost time and at times lives. This effect isn't limited to dramatic emergencies. It also manifests in everyday situations. A classmate is being bullied and everyone stays silent. A coworker makes an inappropriate comment and the room falls silent. Silence spreads not because people agree, but because no one wants to speak first. The fear of shame, of standing out, or of doing something wrong is stronger when others watch. So we wait, we observe, we assume. But the bystander effect is not a rule. It is a tendency. And once you know it, you can fight it. The next time you see something wrong and feel the need to be silent, remember that everyone else may be waiting for you to act. Sometimes it is enough for a single person to act, speak, help break the silence, and the whole group shifts. The illusion that someone else will do it disappears, and suddenly, the responsibility is real and shared. You follow the group, not because you agree, but because you don't want to stand out. That is normative conformity. The need to fit in, even when that means ignoring what you truly think or feel. Maybe you are in a meeting and everyone nods along with an idea that seems wrong to you. But instead of saying anything, you stay silent because you feel safer. Maybe you are with friends and someone makes a joke that seems offensive to you, but you laugh anyway because you don't want to be the one who ruins the atmosphere. The approval of the group becomes more important than your own judgment. This bias affects not only people who are unsure of themselves. It affects everyone. Studies show that even when people know the correct answer, they often agree with the incorrect one if enough people around them do. The discomfort of being the oddball can override logic, evidence, and even values. And the more unanimous the group seems, the stronger the pressure is. You start doubting yourself. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe they know more than I do. Or even worse, you stop worrying about whether you are right and only care about not being rejected. Normative conformity helps keep groups together, but it can also lead to bad decisions, groupthink, and silence when facing injustice. This explains why people follow trends they dislike, agree with opinions they secretly oppose, and sometimes live lives that don't match who they are. The more we depend on others to know what is right and wrong, the more fragile our sense of identity becomes. But recognizing this bias is powerful. It allows you to pause and ask yourself, do I agree because I believe it, or because I don't want to be alone? And that question, that moment of honesty, is often the first step to moving from the crowd and finding your own voice again. You probably think your best qualities are rarer than they are. That is the false uniqueness effect, a bias that makes you believe your talents, values, and achievements are more exceptional than most people's. If you are generous, you may assume that most people aren't. If you value honesty, you may feel that you are one of the few who practice it. If you have done something kind or creative, you may think that not many others would have done it. This bias fuels your sense of individuality, reinforcing the idea that you are special. Not only in a generic sense, but that you are morally unique, talented, and insightful. It is comforting and, in some ways, motivating. Believing that you are different from the rest can give you a sense of purpose and identity, but it also distorts your understanding of others. You may underestimate how many people share your struggles, values, or experiences. You may feel isolated when you aren't. It can even lead to frustration, such as when you think you're the only one who works hard or is honest in a group and wonder why others don't seem to care. This bias manifests not only in your self-image, but affects how you judge others. If you think you're unusually compassionate, you may be quicker to see others as selfish. If you think you are especially open-minded, you may dismiss those who disagree with you as ignorant. The irony is that many people think like that, which means that the belief that you are unique, good, considerate, or capable is actually common. In essence, the false uniqueness effect reveals something about the human mind. We all want to feel distinct, valuable, and irreplaceable. And although that desire is not wrong, it becomes a distortion when it blinds us to the simple truth that other people, silently and invisibly, often share the same goodness that we believe is uncommon. You may be sitting in a room where everyone thinks the same thing, but no one says it because everyone assumes they're the only one who thinks that. That is pluralistic ignorance. It is when all members of a group disagree with something privately, but accept it because they believe everyone else supports it. Thus, no one dares to speak, and silence is confused with consensus. This creates a powerful illusion that the group believes something it doesn't believe. You have probably experienced it without realizing it. Perhaps in class the teacher asked if anyone had questions and you were confused, but you didn't raise your hand because no one else did. You thought, I must be the only one who doesn't understand. But what if everyone else was thinking the same thing? Or imagine a group of friends joking about something offensive. No one laughs, but everyone pretends to, assuming they're the only ones who feel uncomfortable. So the joke continues. Everyone hopes someone will break the illusion, but no one wants to be first. This bias manifests in schools, workplaces, families, and even societies. People act in a way they disagree with because they think they're the only ones who have doubts. This explains how harmful norms persist, not because people believe in them, but because they mistakenly believe that everyone else does. And when you believe that you are the only one who thinks differently, you stay silent and the cycle continues. Pluralistic ignorance thrives in silence. It is not only a lack of honesty, it is a lack of visibility. Everyone hides behind the masks of others. The only way out is through vulnerability. Someone has to say what they truly think. And often when that happens, the illusion breaks. Others dare to speak. The pressure disappears, and you realize that you are not alone. You were just part of a group of people who thought the same as you were. We underestimate how much our emotions control us, and we do the same with others. That is the empathy gap. It is the mental blind spot that stops us from understanding the real power of emotions when we are not feeling them. When we are calm, we can say, I would never lose my temper over something like that, or I would never give in to temptation. But the moment you get angry, feel overwhelmed, or exhausted, everything changes. Suddenly, what you swore you would never do seems inevitable, even justified. The lack of empathy also works in reverse. When you are sad, it is difficult to imagine that you will ever feel good again. Break seem permanent. Anxiety seems like the truth. You forget that emotions change, that your mind will return to normal. It's like being trapped in a storm and forgetting that the blue sky exists. This bias not only affects the way you see yourself, it deeply distorts the way you judge others. When someone breaks down, lashes out, or makes a bad decision, it's easy to think that they are irrational or weak. You forget what it feels like to be in that state. You could say, I should have stayed calm, as if calm were always available. But when we are dominated by strong emotions, reason has no chance. People don't always need advice. They need understanding. And the lack of empathy blocks that understanding. It is one of the reasons why we find it hard to feel compassion, why we give superficial advice, why we don't prepare for how difficult things will really be. We make plans when we are at our best, and we forget to take into account our worst moments. We tell ourselves that we will follow the diet, that we will be patient with our loved ones, that we will be better people, and then we are surprised not to do it. The lack of empathy is like a glitch in the time travel of your brain. You cannot imagine who you will be in a different emotional state, even if that version of yourself is only minutes away. The more aware you are of it, the more forgiving you will be of your past self, your future self, and other people who are just as entangled in their own storms. You are more likely to accept an argument if the conclusion seems correct to you, even if the logic that leads to it is wrong. That is the belief bias. It is the mental shortcut by which we judge the strength of reasoning not by its validity, but by whether we already agree with the result. If someone says something that matches what you already believe, you will probably nod, even if their reasoning is full of holes. But if the conclusion seems wrong to you, if it challenges your vision of the world, you will start to dismantle the argument. Even if it is logically irrefutable, this bias appears everywhere. In politics, religion, social issues, even in informal debates with friends. If someone you agree with presents a bad argument, you may not notice or excuse it. But if someone you disagree with presents a solid argument, your brain may enter defensive mode. The belief bias is not about being purposely irrational. It is about the extent our existing beliefs condition how we evaluate information. It's like putting on tinted glasses. You keep seeing, but everything is stained by what you already believe. Over time, this creates echo chambers where people stop listening to reasoning and only pursue arguments that seem right to them. It is part of the reason debates rarely change opinions. It is not enough to be logically correct. You have to overcome the emotional filter people use to process logic in the first place. The belief bias shows us how reason and beliefs are not always aligned. And unless we actively question ourselves, we confuse what makes sense with what we simply want to be true. It is natural to defend your own point of view, even when the evidence is weak or you are wrong. And that is my partial bias. It is the mental reflex that makes you instantly protect your beliefs, your opinions, your team, your identity. When you hear an argument that supports your position, you are more likely to accept it without question. When you hear an argument from the opposite side, your brain starts working not to understand it, but to dismantle it. You look for flaws, inconsistencies, and anything that allows you to discard it, even if it contains valid arguments. It's not about intelligence. In fact, studies show that more intelligent people are often better at rationalizing their own views. They use their intellectual capacity not to seek truth, but to build stronger walls around what they believe. And since it seems that you're thinking critically, it is easy to confuse bias towards my own side with careful reasoning. But in reality, you're acting as a mental lawyer, not a judge. You argue in favor of your side. You do not weigh both sides impartially. My bias towards my own side manifests itself everywhere. In politics, religion, social debates, scientific discussions, and even in discussions about which brand of phone is better. That is why debates so often turn into shouting matches. Both sides believe they are being logical when they are only defending their territory. And it is not limited to discussions. You are more likely to pay attention to data that supports your beliefs, to remember the stories that give you reason, and to surround yourself with people who agree with you. That makes your point of view more obvious and correct because everyone around you sees the world the same way. It is a vicious circle. The danger is that partiality can trap you in a bubble. It makes you less curious, less empathetic, and less likely to grow. But the moment you realize you are doing it, that instinctive need to be right, you can take a step back. You can ask yourself, what if I am wrong? Or, how would this sound if it came from my side? That change, that pinch of humility, is what turns a closed mind into an open mind. And in a world full of noisy opinions, an open mind is rare and powerful. When you do something good, you may feel that you have earned a right to do something not so good afterward. And that is the effect of moral licensing. It is a strange psychological gap by which past moral behavior gives you a kind of license to relax standards. For example, if you donate to charity in the morning, you may feel more justified in spending on something superfluous in the afternoon. If you defend someone in a situation, you may feel less guilty ignoring an injustice later. It is not that you have suddenly become less ethical. It is that your brain silently adds up your good person points and uses them as an excuse to make questionable decisions. This bias can manifest in very subtle ways. An executive who prides himself on hiring people from diverse backgrounds may feel less pressure when considering equity when promoting someone. A person who strongly identifies with a cause may feel less need to control their own behavior because they're already on the right side. It is as if a good action becomes a moral shield that allows us to excuse actions we would normally question in others. The dangerous thing is that we rarely realize this happens. It seems like balance or justice to us, when in reality it is self-deception disguised as virtue. And the more we identify as a good person, the more vulnerable we are to it. The moment we start thinking we are irreproachable, we stop taking responsibility for actions. The effect of moral credentials reminds us that being ethical is not a status that one reaches. It is a practice that must be maintained. You do not get a lifetime pass for doing the right thing just once. True morality is not a marker. It is what you choose when no one sees, when it is inconvenient, and when you have nothing left to prove. You think you're a good person, but then do something that does not quite fit. Maybe you lie. Maybe you cheat a little. Maybe you hurt someone you care about. That uncomfortable tension you feel afterwards. That persistent mental unease that something does not add up is cognitive dissonance. It is what happens when your actions and beliefs conflict, and your brain strives to close the gap. You can justify what you did by saying, everyone would have done the same. It was not that bad, or they deserved it. That is not just an excuse. Is your mind working hard to protect your self-image? Cognitive dissonance is not limited to morality. It appears when someone who smokes knows that it is harmful, but continues smoking. Instead of quitting smoking, you can minimize the risks or say things like, my grandfather smoked and lived to be 95 years old. It happens when someone stays in a toxic relationship, but insists that it is not so bad. Or when people invest time, money, or emotions in something, and then refuse to admit it was a mistake. Because doing so would mean admitting that they were wrong. And that hurts more than continuing on this path. This bias can distort logic in subtle ways. It can cause people to deny science that clashes with their world vision, defend beliefs with which they no longer totally agree, or reject new ideas just because accepting them would mean rethinking years of assumptions. The mind wants coherence. It wants to see itself as rational, kind, and in control. Therefore, when reality threatens that image, the brain does not always change its behavior. It changes the story. Sometimes dissonance drives growth. Feeling uncomfortable can lead to reflection, change, and deeper honesty. But more often, it leads to rationalization, a patch over a deeper conflict. We tell ourselves whatever it takes to prevent our inner world from collapsing, even if it means ignoring truth. That is the power of cognitive dissonance. It not only protects our beliefs, it protects who we think we are. You think you see the world as it is, as if your perceptions, beliefs, and judgments were simply reflections of objective reality. That is naive realism. It is the feeling that your point of view is not just a point of view, but the truth, clear and obvious. And if other people see things differently, well, then they must be misinformed, irrational, biased, or simply not paying attention. It is not that you think you're always right. It is that your version of reality seems so immediate and natural to you that you find it hard to imagine someone could see it differently. This illusion begins early and is deeply rooted. If you see a political debate and someone makes an argument that matches your beliefs, it seems clear and reasonable. If the other party presents a counterargument, it seems manipulative or erroneous, even if it is structured the same way. You assume that your judgments are based on evidence and logic, while others are carried away by emotion, propaganda, or ignorance. And yet, everyone else thinks the same of you. Naive realism is not limited to politics or major themes. It is present in daily life, too. A friend forgets to respond to a message, and you assume he is rude or distant. But, from his point of view, he was just distracted or overwhelmed. Two people can see the same situation and reach totally different conclusions, each convinced that their version is the true one. That is the power of perspective and the trap of forgetting we have one. What makes naive realism so dangerous? Is it the fact that it blocks curiosity? If you think you already see things as they are, why listen to others? Why ask questions, reflect, or explore other points of view? The truth is that each person's perception is filtered by their culture, emotions, and memory. No one sees the world with complete clarity. Recognizing that your point of view is just a lens among many others does not make you seem weak. It makes you wiser. Because once you accept that your perception is not the whole picture, you are finally able to start seeing more. You think that because someone has had a streak of success, they are likely to continue being successful. That is the hot hand fallacy. It is the feeling that momentum builds in such a way that the next success seems almost certain. When someone performs several tasks in a row, makes a series of smart decisions, or seems to be on a lucky streak, we assume that they are on a streak and that the pattern will continue. But in reality, these streaks are usually just coincidences, random groupings we confuse with significant trends. This fallacy manifests in how we judge ourselves and others. If someone has made 3 good decisions in a row, we begin to believe they have discovered a winning mentality, as if success were contagious. We overlook the possibility that chance, timing, or external factors have influenced things equally. And when a streak finally ends, as it usually does, we feel surprised or confused because we thought the person had found something special. We fall into the hot hand fallacy because our brain is programmed to see patterns even where none exist. It gives us a sense of predictability and control. We like to believe that success builds on itself, as if by magic, and that we can ride the wave of a lucky moment just by realizing it. But in many situations, what looks like a lucky streak is actually just random behavior. Sometimes things cluster, and sometimes they don't. The key is to resist the temptation to see streaks as signs of inevitability and learn to separate real skill from the noise of chance. You hear a piece of data that contradicts what you believe, and instead of changing your mind, you cling even more tightly to your idea. That is the backfire effect. It is one of the most peculiar aspects of the human mind. When your beliefs are challenged by evidence, not only do you tend to reject the new information, but you become even more convinced that you are right. You don't update your way of thinking, but we reinforce it, as if adding more bricks to a mental wall. This happens because beliefs are not just ideas that we have. They're often a part of who we are. They're connected to our identity, our values, and our sense of belonging. Therefore, when someone presents evidence that contradicts your point of view, whether political, religious, or personal, you do not perceive it as a useful correction. You perceive it as an attack, and your brain treats it as one. You become defensive. Your reasoning becomes sharper, but not to evaluate the truth. Its goal is to protect your current point of view at any cost. The backfire effect manifests in all kinds of situations. A person who believes in a conspiracy theory can reject hundreds of pieces of evidence against it, but cling to a single one that seems to support it. Someone with firm political opinions can read a fact check and come away even more convinced that the checkers are biased. And if you try to persuade someone with a rational and calm argument, they may not budge an inch. In fact, they may leave the conversation more convinced that you are wrong. And they are right. The disturbing thing is that the backfire effect doesn't just happen to other people. It happens to each of us. The more intelligent you are, the better you can rationalize your beliefs instead of changing them. Intelligence becomes a tool of self-defense, not for self-reflection. And since it seems that you are thinking critically, it is hard to realize that you are actually resisting the truth. But there is hope. The counterproductive effect is not unstoppable. It only needs the right conditions to soften. People are more open to change when they feel safe, not judged, and when the challenge to their beliefs comes from someone they trust. Changing someone's opinion, or your own, requires more than facts. It requires humility, empathy, and willingness to let go of the need to always be right. When you firmly believe in something, you start acting in ways that make it come true, whether you want it or not. That is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It begins as an expectation, a prediction, or even a feeling. But little by little, that thought shapes your behavior, and your behavior shapes reality. If you walk into a room believing that people won't like you, you may avoid eye contact, give brief answers, and make a cold or disinterested impression. And what happens? People walk away and you say to yourself, I knew it. I knew they wouldn't like me. Prophecy not only reflects reality, but also creates it. A teacher who believes that a student is gifted may, unknowingly, pay more attention, encourage them more, and dedicate more time to answering their questions. That student, feeling supported, begins to perform better. The teacher was right, but only because they acted on that belief. However, the opposite can occur. If you expect someone to fail and treat them as a failure, they are likely to start believing it too. This happens in relationships, at school, at work, even with yourself. If you tell yourself that you are bad at public speaking, you may never practice. You will be more anxious when you try and less confident when speaking. The result reinforces the belief, and the cycle repeats. It's not magic, it's psychology. Thoughts shape behavior, and behavior shapes results. The strangest thing is that self-fulfilling prophecies can seem like objective truths. We don't see how our beliefs influence our actions. We believe that we are only reacting to the world, not realizing that we have contributed to creating what we are reacting to. It's like writing the end of a story while pretending you're just reading it. But there's a hopeful side. If negative expectations can trap you, positive ones can free you. If you believe you can improve, connect, and grow, your actions often follow, and reality can rise to meet that belief. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a powerful mental loop. The trick is to be aware of it. Thus, you are not only a character in the story, but also its author. You are biased, but one of the most stubborn biases is believing that you are not. It is the blind spot bias. It is the tendency to see the thinking of others as flawed, while assuming that one's own reasoning is fair, objective, and rational. You can detect confirmation bias in a friend's political argument or realize when someone falls into a stereotype. But when it's your turn, you sincerely feel that you're being logical. This creates a strange mental illusion. You become an expert at detecting biases in others, while remaining blind to your own. It's not that you're lying or being disingenuous. It's that your brain is protecting your self-image. Nobody likes to think they are irrational. Therefore, even when you make a decision based on emotion, impulse, or social pressure, your mind finds a way to justify it. You can think, I'm only following my instinct, or I have investigated it, even if your conclusions are based more on personal beliefs than facts. And when someone challenges you, you get defensive, not because you are stubborn, but because you really do not see what they see. The real trap is that the more intelligent or aware you are, the more likely you are to believe that you have escaped bias when, in reality, you're only better at rationalizing them. The blind spot bias does not affect only people. It distorts conversations, relationships, and even entire societies. It makes debates go around in circles. It is the reason why people talk without listening to each other, why apologies seem insincere, and why change is so difficult. Everyone thinks that they are the reasonable ones and that the other party does not understand. Admitting that you have a blind spot bias does not make you weak, it makes you wise. It is one of the most difficult things to do. Stop assuming that you are the exception. But when you do, something powerful happens. You start to question your own assumptions. You listen more attentively. You see your own thinking not as perfect, but as a work in progress. Sometimes you are presented with a choice that nobody wants, not so that you choose it, but to manipulate the other choice you will make. It is the decoy effect. Imagine that you have to choose between two options. Some small popcorn for $3 or some large ones for $7. The price difference seems large, so you decide on the small one. But now imagine that a third option is added. Some medium popcorn for $6. Suddenly, the large ones seem like a bargain. Only $1 more for a large increase in size, and you choose them. But the medium size was never intended to be sold. It was a carefully designed decoy to make the large one seem like the smartest option. This happens constantly in restaurants, electronic stores, and subscription services. Every time someone wants to influence your decision without you feeling obligated, The decoy does not have to be attractive. It only has to change the way you compare the real options. A low-level gym subscription with bad benefits makes the mid-level one seem reasonable. A horrible hotel room makes a slightly better one seem luxurious. Your mind stops thinking, "Do I need this?" and starts thinking, "Which of these has the best value?" And so, without further ado, you have been guided not by logic, but by comparison. The decoy effect is powerful because it works silently. You feel that you're making a rational and informed decision when, in reality, the structure of the options has already shaped your answer. It is not about what you want. It is about how your desires are directed. Once you realize, you start to see decoys everywhere. Not only in prices, but also in arguments, politics, and even in dating apps. A bad option placed in the right place can change everything without even being chosen. You assume that specific and detailed scenarios are more likely than general ones. And that is the conjunction fallacy. It happens when your intuition deceives you by making you believe that adding more information makes something more likely, even though mathematically it is less likely. A classic example is like this. You hear about Linda. They describe her as an outspoken, intelligent person, deeply concerned about social justice and active in protests. Then they ask you what is more likely, that Linda is a bank teller or that she's a bank teller and feminist. Most people choose the second option, but logically that cannot be true. The probability of two things happening together is always less than or equal to the probability of only one happening. But the detailed description seems so accurate that it trumps logic. This fallacy appears constantly in daily thought. You hear that someone is athletic and competitive, so you assume that he is a personal trainer, that he also competes in triathlons, when in reality it is more likely that he is only a personal trainer. The additional details make the story seem richer, more vivid, and credible. But more details do not equal more truth. It just means more narrative. The conjunction fallacy plays on your brain's narrative instinct. You want things to make sense and be coherent. But coherence is not the same as probability. The fact that a story sounds good does not guarantee it is true. And this error does not affect only your opinions. It affects your decisions. You may overestimate risks because they include vivid details or underestimate something simple because it seems too boring to be true. In essence, the conjunction fallacy reveals a tension between how we feel and how we reason. Your instinct loves stories. Your brain needs numbers, but unless you are careful, the story always wins. You flip a coin, and it comes up heads 5 times consecutively. You feel it in your gut. The next one has to be tails. It is what must happen. It would be odd if it came up heads again. But that feeling, however strong and convincing, is completely wrong. This is the Monte Carlo fallacy, also known as gambler's fallacy. The belief that random events of the past affect the outcome of the future, even when each event is independent. Its name comes from a real incident at the Casino de Monte Carlo in 1913. During a roulette game, the ball landed on black 26 consecutive times. People lost millions betting on red, believing that red was due, that it had to come out next. But roulette, like flipping a coin or rolling dice, has no memory. Each spin is an isolated event, which is not affected by what has happened previously. Roulette does not care about what happened last time. The fallacy manifests not only in gambling, but also in everyday thinking. If you have failed several job interviews consecutively, you may feel that your luck must change. If it has rained 5 days consecutively, you may assume that the next day will be sunny. We have a deep need to believe that the universe balances itself quickly, that randomness is soon compensated. But that is not how probability functions. Random patterns and streaks occur constantly. They are not signals or corrections. They are simply the natural chaos of chance. The Monte Carlo fallacy deceives us because we expect instant justice. We want randomness to appear orderly and balanced. But true randomness can seem very unfair, irregular, and very strange. That discomfort we feel when the same result repeats over and over. It is the illusion speaking. The world owes you nothing. You see a small pattern and draw a large conclusion. That is the law of small numbers bias. the belief that a small amount of data can reveal the entire truth. If a new restaurant gets 3 negative reviews, you may decide that it is horrible. If you meet 2 rude people from a city, you may assume that the whole city is like that. Your brain wants to find meaning quickly and treats small samples as statistically reliable, even when they are not. This bias stems from our deep discomfort with randomness. We want the world to make sense, to follow rules and trends that we quickly detect. But true randomness often includes streaks, groupings, or outliers that mean nothing. If you flip a coin 5 times and it comes up heads 4 times, the law of small numbers makes you feel like something suspicious is happening, as if the coin were rigged, even though that's just chance. You expect small samples to behave like large ones, forgetting that patterns only stabilize with enough data. It's not just a mathematical problem. It affects real decisions. Investors may see a few weeks of rising stocks and take it for a long-term trend. Doctors may rely on a few patient cases rather than larger studies. Politicians may change entire policies based on a few loud complaints. The danger is that acting with very little information can lead to overconfidence, poor judgment, and decisions based more on anecdotes than reality. The truth is that small numbers lie all the time. It's not because people are wrong to notice patterns. It's because our brains evolved to be fast, not statistically accurate. You instinctively prefer the idea of completely eliminating a small risk to greatly reducing a much larger one. And that's called zero-risk bias. It is more satisfying to completely eliminate a danger than to make a greater threat far less dangerous. Even if the second option would help you more in the long run, if 2 safety measures are presented, one that reduces a minor risk from 1% to 0%, and another that reduces a serious risk from 50% to 30%, many people will choose the first, even though the second saves many more lives or avoids more damage. This bias manifests itself in everything from healthcare to public policies to personal decisions. People will spend more money on water filters that remove every last trace of a harmless chemical, while ignoring lifestyle changes that could drastically reduce their risk of heart disease or cancer. That's why some companies emphasize that their product eliminates 100% of germs, even if that doesn't make you safer than one that eliminates 99%. There is something deeply emotional about the number 0. It gives us a false sense of control, of purpose, of total security. The zero-risk bias plays with our desire for closure. We don't just want to reduce danger. We want it to disappear. We are attracted to clean and absolute solutions, even if they are not the most logical or efficient. But in reality, almost nothing is zero risk. Life is full of trade-offs, and seeking perfect security in one area often blinds us to much greater dangers in other areas. Ironically, the obsession with eliminating minimal risks can make us overlook smarter options that would protect us more overall. This bias also affects the way we judge others. A person or company that does not eliminate a small visible risk may be more criticized than another that silently tolerates greater hidden risks. Your brain has a hard time feeling the difference between a tragedy that affects a few and another that affects millions. And that is insensitivity to scope. It is a cognitive failure in which numbers lose their emotional meaning when they are too large. You may feel deep compassion when you see a single photo of a hungry child, but when you're told that thousands are suffering the same fate, the emotional impact does not increase. Sometimes it even decreases. It's not that you don't care, it's that your ability to care is not proportional to the numbers. This bias makes it difficult to make rational decisions about important issues. You may be willing to donate $50 to save an endangered bird, but hesitate to donate $100 to save 1,000. The accounts don't add up, but your emotions guide your judgment more than logic. Your heart responds to vivid stories, not statistics. A single crying face moves you more than 1,000 anonymous lives. Marketing professionals, politicians, and charities understand this well. That is why they often focus on one person with whom it is easy to identify, rather than on a sea of anonymous data. A victim, a face, a name. That's what hits home. But the result is strange. Your concern may be deeply sincere, but does not grow proportionally to the magnitude of the problem. You may be as affected by the loss of a dog as by that of an entire endangered species. Scope and sensitivity also affect how we react to global problems like climate change, war, or poverty. We hear figures, millions of displaced people, billions affected, but those figures become mere background noise. Our emotional system evolved to worry about the small and local, not the massive and abstract. Therefore, the bigger the problem, the more emotionally distant we feel. It is not a sign of apathy. It is a sign of being human. Our minds are simply not prepared to understand the true weight of massive numbers. But understanding this illusion gives us the opportunity to act more deliberately, to make decisions based not only on what seems urgent, but on what really matters. You tend to avoid options that involve uncertainty, even when those options could be better. And that is the effect of ambiguity in action. Imagine you are choosing between two restaurants. One has a long list of reviews, the other has none. Even if the second restaurant could be incredible, you're more likely to choose the first just because you know more about it. When details are missing or when the result is not clear, your brain leans silently. Not because it is logical, but because uncertainty makes you uncomfortable. This bias manifests in big and small decisions. People often invest in well-known companies rather than in new emerging companies, even if the latter have greater potential. In medical decisions, patients lean towards treatments with known risks, even when newer options with unknown probabilities could be more effective. In politics, voters stick with the candidate whose flaws they know rather than taking a risk with someone they don't fully understand. The strange thing is that the unknown does not automatically mean bad. It just means we don't have enough information. But our mind does not like voids. They treat ambiguity as a danger, even when there is no reason for it. That is why we play it safe, which is not always smart. The effect of ambiguity is one of the reasons why innovation is resisted, why we hesitate to try new things, and why we sometimes get stuck in situations that are familiar to us, but that are far from ideal. This bias protects us from risk, but it also protects us from opportunities. The next time you find yourself recoiling from an option just because you're not sure, take a second look. That discomfort may not be a warning sign. It may just be your brain being cautious about the unknown. And sometimes the most valuable paths are those that you cannot yet see completely. When something seems safer, more risks are often assumed. And that is the paradox of risk compensation. It is about the idea that when a situation becomes safer, people tend to behave less cautiously, which counteracts some of the benefits of that safety. Imagine a driver with anti-lock brakes and advanced airbags. Feeling more protected, he may drive faster or brake later, unknowingly increasing the chances of an accident. What is designed to keep you safer gives you the confidence to take more risks. This behavior is not limited to driving. Cyclists who wear helmets may drive more aggressively in traffic. People who use hand sanitizer regularly may touch their face more often. Seatbelts, smoke alarms, sunscreen, and even condoms. Any tool intended to reduce danger can lead to subtle changes in our behavior, making us feel more comfortable with risk simply because fear is reduced. It is not that these security measures are bad. They save lives, but they don't always make us as cautious as we think. The bias works at a subconscious level. You don't say, "I'm going to be reckless because I have a safety net." You simply feel more relaxed, and your behavior changes naturally. In some cases, that change is small. In others, it is so drastic that it completely nullifies the benefit. That is why some public health campaigns fail. People believe that, having taken a precaution, they are protected, and then they stop worrying about things they should still be careful with. Risk compensation reminds us that safety is not about just the tools we use. It is about how we respond to those tools. Sometimes, feeling safer can deceive us and make us less safe. We choose what makes us feel good now, even if that means sacrificing something better later. That is hyperbolic discounting, a bias that makes us value immediate rewards more than future ones, even when waiting would clearly be smarter. That is why people procrastinate, overspend, skip things, and eat junk food. At the moment, the long-term goal feels distant and vague, while short-term pleasure is vivid and tempting right in front of you. You say you will start the diet on Monday, that you will save money next month, that you will study tomorrow, but when the time comes, the future loses again. This bias does not affect only small decisions. It shapes all of life. People invest little in their retirement, delay important medical checkups, or maintain bad habits because the benefits of change take too long to appear. Hyperbolic discounting means that a reward loses value the further away it is in time. But the fall is not gradual. It is steep. A reward today seems much more valuable than the same reward within a week. But if both rewards are far in the future, the bias disappears. You would probably say that you prefer to have $100 within 31 days than $90 within 30 days. But if it is about $90 today or $100 tomorrow, most people stay with $90. The strange thing is that we are aware of it. We know that later we will regret having chosen the easiest path, but the bias still wins. That is why we make plans in advance to restrict our future behavior. We buy gym memberships, use timers, install productivity applications, not to make better decisions at the moment, but to protect ourselves from our future selves. Hyperbolic discounting reveals a kind of internal conflict with time. The person you are today has more power than the person you will be tomorrow, even though both are you. And that constant battle between short-term desire and long-term wisdom is one of the most human struggles that exist. Sometimes things simply return to normal, and we confuse it with something we have done. That is regression to the mean. Imagine a student who gets a grade well below their usual average on an exam. The next time he gets a higher grade, and people say, "You see, studying helps." Or an athlete has an incredible game followed by a weaker one, and fans begin to speculate about injuries, pressure, or motivation. But what has really happened? Only a return to the mean. Extreme ups and downs are often followed by more typical results. Not because of any drastic change, but because randomness tends to balance out. It is a natural statistical pattern, but we rarely see it that way. We look for causes because our brain is programmed for stories, not probabilities. Thus, when someone has a streak of good luck and then goes through a bad streak, we assume that they have lost their touch. When someone does badly and then does better, we attribute it to a new strategy, a motivational speech, or a lucky charm. But often what we see is just noise smoothing out over time. This bias appears everywhere. In business, sports, education, medicine. A patient tries a new treatment after a really bad week and begins to improve. But maybe he would have improved anyway. A company's shares plummet, then recover, and the chief executive is praised for restoring confidence, when in reality the fall and rebound were just part of normal volatility. What makes regression to the mean so deceptive is that it mimics cause and effect. We feel that someone or something must be responsible for the change because we crave reasons. But sometimes the most honest explanation is the least satisfying. It was just a regression to the mean, without heroes, villains, or miracles. Only the calm gravity of statistics returns things to normality as we hurry to invent a story. When you focus on something, it suddenly seems to be the most important thing in the world, although in the general panorama, it barely has importance. That is the illusion of focus. It deceives your brain so that it magnifies what you have in front, making it seem that all your happiness or well-being depend on it. If you worry about money, having more seems like it would solve everything. If you're thinking about a relationship, you feel that relationship is key to your future. If something unimportant bothers you, like traffic, a rude comment, or a delayed flight, it can dominate your entire emotional state, even though the rest of your life is going well. The illusion of concentration whispers, "This is everything." And for a time, you believe it. But that belief is not reality. It is a trick of attention. This is clearly seen in how people imagine their futures. Someone might think, if I get that job, I will be happy, or once I move to a better city, everything will be smooth. But after getting the job or moving, life goes back to normal. The mind shifts its focus to something else, and the cycle repeats. It is why we overestimate how happy or unhappy important events will make us. Winning the lottery, getting married, suffering a loss, facing failure. None of these things affects our happiness as permanently as we expect. The mind adapts, but at the moment, what you focus on seems like the whole story. The illusion of concentration is powerful because it narrows your consciousness. It blinds you to everything that is going well. It makes you forget your broader goals, your values, and even your physical surroundings. When you are trapped in it, your thoughts reduce to a single focus, and the rest of the scene darkens. But there is good news. If your mood can worsen by focusing too much on a problem, it can also improve when you deliberately shift your attention. Your mind constantly creates reality by deciding what to emphasize. The illusion of concentration reminds us that perspective is not just a mental trick. It is the basis of how we experience life. What you focus on becomes your world. Choose carefully. You tend to value things more simply because they are yours, even if nothing else has changed. That is the endowment effect. If given a cup and a few minutes later, someone offers to buy it from you, you will probably want more money for it than you would have been willing to pay for it just 5 minutes before. It's not about the cup. It's about ownership. The moment something becomes yours, your brain attributes extra value to it, often irrationally. This manifests itself in many ways. You may overprice something you're trying to sell online because you have had it for a while, even though buyers see it as just another used item. Or maybe you resist throwing away old clothes, appliances, or furniture, not because you need them, but because you have had them so long that you feel they are part of you. The same is true for ideas and beliefs. We become emotionally attached to our opinions simply because they are ours, and then we defend them, even when they do not stand up to rigorous analysis. The endowment effect reveals how much ownership influences our perception. What we own becomes an extension of ourselves, and getting rid of it, even in theory, feels like a loss. That is why you may reject a fair exchange or ask more for something than you would pay to get it. Economically, that makes no sense. Psychologically, it makes sense in all of the world. We don't just own things. We identify with them. And once something becomes ours, letting go of it is like losing part of ourselves. You tend to value something more just because you built it yourself, even if it is not a big deal. It is the IKEA effect, and it explains why assembling a wobbly shelf with your own hands makes it seem, in some way, like a masterpiece. It is not about quality. It is about effort. When you dedicate time and energy to something, be it a project, a meal, or a relationship, your brain assigns more value to it simply because it is yours. Even if another person could do it better or faster, it does not matter. It would not be the same. This effect goes far beyond furniture. It manifests in school projects, in emerging companies, in raising children, and in creative work. You can write a song, paint a wall, or design a personal website that is objectively mediocre, but since you have done it, it seems special. You have invested emotionally, and that investment can make you blind to the defects. It can lead to overconfidence, resistance to external help, and the classic attitude of my way is best, even when it clearly is not. What is fascinating is that this bias touches a deep part of what makes us human, the desire to create, to shape the world, and leave a mark. We like to feel that something exists thanks to us, that our contribution matters. The IKEA effect gives us a sense of ownership. And with ownership comes pride, but also a trap. You can cling to bad ideas just because they are yours, reject better alternatives, or get stuck defending something simply because you have worked on it. At best, the IKEA effect motivates you to care, to take initiative and finish what you start. At worst, it ties you to things that do not serve you. Recognizing this bias does not mean you stop loving the things you build. It only means that you can take a step back and ask yourself, do I value this because it is good or just because it is mine? And sometimes that question can make all the difference. After making a decision, your brain begins to work in the background to convince you that it was right, even if it was not. That is the choice support bias. It is the tendency to see our choices more favorably than they deserve, simply because we made them. Imagine you buy a new phone, and soon after you find out that there's another model that could be better. Instead of admitting that maybe you chose wrong, you start to highlight everything good about your purchase. The camera is incredible. It seems more resistant. I do not even care about that other feature. Your mind changes the story so that your choice seems smarter, more reasonable, and even inevitable. This happens in relationships, in a professional career, in politics, everywhere. You go out with someone, and even if things go wrong, you find yourself defending them to your friends. Why? Because admitting that you chose wrong is like admitting a defect in yourself. So you highlight its strengths and minimize the warning signs. Or let's say you vote for a politician who then makes mistakes. Instead of changing your mind, you emphasize the positive aspects, minimize the damage, or blame others. The bias is not about the facts. It is about preserving your sense of identity and competence. What makes the support bias especially misleading is how it affects memory. Over time, we tend to forget the defects of the option we chose and exaggerate the problems of those we did not. It is like rewriting history to flatter our past self. And although it can give us confidence and tranquility, it can also trap us in bad decisions. We insist instead of learning. We rationalize instead of reflecting. But there is power in recognizing this pattern. You can continue feeling good about your choices and stay open to growth. The fact that you chose something does not mean it was perfect, and admitting this does not make you weak. It makes you wiser. You think others know you better than they really do, that your emotions, intentions, and thoughts are more obvious than they are. That is the illusion of transparency. When you're nervous during a speech, you take it for granted that everyone notices. When you tell a lie, you feel your face betrays you. When upset, you expect others to realize and ask what is wrong, but often they do not. You think your inner world filters to the outside. But for everyone else, you seem fine, calm, neutral, or impenetrable. This illusion occurs because your own emotions are so intense that you find it hard to imagine they are not just as intense for others. If your heart beats strongly, your hands sweat, or you are repeating a mistake in your head, you take it for granted that those signs must be evident. But the truth is people are often too focused on their own internal noise to notice yours. They are busy wondering what you think of them. The illusion of transparency creates misunderstanding twofold. You overestimate how much people understand you and underestimate how lost they are in their own minds. This also manifests in discussions and relationships. You believe that you have expressed yourself clearly when, in reality, the other person has not grasped your hints or your tone. You expect them to read between the lines, but they're not even reading the same page. This leads to frustration. Why do they not understand it? Is it not obvious? But it is not. Communication is more complicated than we like to admit. What seems clear inside you can come out confused, subtle, or completely invisible. The illusion of transparency makes us more aware of ourselves than necessary and more frustrated when others do not respond as we expect. But once you realize that it is just an illusion, that you're not as transparent as you think, you can learn to speak with more clarity, worry less about the judgment of others, and understand that silence does not always mean someone knows what you feel. Most of the time, they do not know. You tend to see yourself as the center of all situations, whether you want to or not. That is an egocentric bias, and it colors your interpretation of the world. When something goes wrong in a group project, you first look at your own effort. If someone seems upset, you assume it is because of something you said. If the traffic is terrible or the line is long, you feel the universe is causing you personal inconvenience. You're not being selfish on purpose. It is just that your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences are the most vivid and accessible. You live inside your own head 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that perspective becomes your default lens. This bias can affect everything, from your memory to moral judgments. You're more likely to remember what you said in a conversation than what others did. You overestimate the importance of your actions in the success or failure within a group. You may feel you are being very clear when explaining something because it makes sense in your mind, even if others do not understand. When people do not agree with you, it is easy to think that they simply do not see things correctly, that is, in your own way. The egocentric bias also leads you to assume that others pay more attention to you and think more about you than they do. It is possible that you obsess over a small mistake or awkward moment, repeating it in your head, convinced everyone else noticed it. But most likely they have not, even if they were in the same room. They were busy being the protagonists of their own lives. What makes the egocentric bias so deceptive is that it seems completely natural. Of course, your perspective seems most important. It is the one you experience directly, but getting out of it takes effort. It means actively imagining that other people have internal worlds as rich and complex as yours, even if you cannot see them. The more we recognize this bias, the more we can open ourselves to perspectives beyond our own. And in doing so, our world does not shrink, but expands. We remember things better when they relate to us personally. It is the self-reference effect. Therefore, from a list of random words, we are more likely to remember those that relate to our own life, such as pizza, if it is our favorite food, or a cat, if we have one at home. Our brain is constantly filtering information. And one of the strongest signals it hears is, does this have anything to do with me? This bias is why teachers ask students to apply lessons to their own experiences and why advertisers present products as part of your lifestyle. It's why you remember a fact better if you relate it to your childhood, your favorite movie, or a personal story. Even the most mundane things can become memorable if they pass through the filter of your identity. A list of historical dates becomes more interesting if one of them is your birthday. A random statistic sticks with you if it reminds you of your hometown. But this effect goes beyond memory. It shapes your perception of the world. If something seems related to you, it automatically seems more important. That's why people can feel emotionally attached to their sports jersey number or feel a strange connection to a hurricane just because it shares their name. It is also the reason why personalized messages, such as hearing your name in a crowded room, instantly grab your attention, even if you are not listening to anything else. The self-reference effect reveals something simple but powerful. You are the anchor point of your own reality. Everything is filtered through your story. And while that can help you learn, grow, and remember, it can also make it difficult to see things from other perspectives. Because when everything is seen in terms of how it relates to you, it's easy to forget that most of the world doesn't revolve around your story. It just passes through it. You are more likely to prefer things that share letters with your own name, especially the first letter, and you probably don't even realize it. It is the namelet effect, a subtle bias that makes us feel attracted to brands, places, and even people that are a little more familiar to us because they remind us of ourselves. For example, if your name is Sarah, you may be more attracted to a company called Sunrise Studios than BlackRock Media, even if you're not aware of why. If your name is Michael, you may think that the city of Milwaukee sounds a little better than average. It is not limited to preferences. This effect has also been linked to more important life decisions. People are statistically more likely to live in cities or work in professions that begin with the same letter as their names. Alora might lean towards law, a dentist toward dentistry. Not always, but enough to be measurable. It sounds strange, but your sense of identity subtly shapes your view of the world in ways that feel intuitive rather than deliberate. These preferences are not based on logic or value. They are based on the unconscious comfort of recognition. Why does this happen? Because your name is one of the most emotionally charged sounds in your entire life. It is linked to your sense of identity. So, when something reflects a part of your name back to you, your brain lights up with a kind of silent approval. Hey, that's part of me. It feels familiar, safe, and pleasant, even if you don't know why. The namelet effect is a silent reminder that we are always in small and surprising ways looking for our place in the world around us. You love good stories. Your brain naturally seeks causes, characters, and meaning, even when there is none. That is the narrative fallacy. The tendency to turn chaotic or random events into clear and understandable stories. When a stock market crashes, people immediately try to explain it with simple narratives. It was greed or bad leadership. Although the reality may involve hundreds of complex, interacting variables and no single story can capture it, the story simply makes us feel better. It makes chaos more digestible. We do this also with history. We tell ourselves that a person's speech sparked a revolution or that a single invention changed the world overnight. In reality, these events were shaped by long, confusing chains of coincidences, conflicts, and contexts. But that doesn't make a good story. So we simplify, flatten, insert heroes and villains where there may be none. The narrative fallacy appears also in everyday life. If something good happens to you, you might say, "It's because I worked hard." And if something bad happens, you might say, "It's because I screwed it up." And it is not limited to the past. The narrative fallacy affects also how you predict the future. You imagine what is going to happen based on the story you think you're in. If you see yourself as the loser, you expect a dramatic comeback. If you think life has been too good lately, you prepare for an unexpected twist. You are not only living your life, you are narrating it, shaping your memories and expectations into a narrative arc that may not be true. The problem is not that stories are bad. They help us learn, relate, and find meaning. But the danger arises when we confuse the story with truth. You often think you have more control over things than you do. That is the illusion of control, a mental flaw that makes you feel like you are in command, even when you're just enjoying the ride. It manifests in small things, like pressing the elevator button several times as if that were going to make it arrive faster, or choosing lottery numbers because it seems more fortunate to you than choosing them at random. It also manifests in important things, like thinking that your attitude alone can determine the outcome of a job interview, or that your rituals before an exam or game somehow influence the results. This illusion is comforting. It gives you a sense of control in a chaotic world. If things go well, you feel that your decisions made it possible. If things go wrong, at least you feel like you could have done something differently. People often believe that they can influence random events simply by being more focused, careful, or confident, even when the outcome is pure chance. Players throw dice harder when they want a high number and more gently when they want a low one, as if the force behind the throw really mattered. Investors believe that their intuition can outsmart the market. Athletes cling to rituals that they swear help them to win. The illusion of control can be motivating. It pushes people to prepare, to act, to stay engaged, but also makes failure feel more personal than it should. It leads to blaming others when things go wrong. Not only others, but also oneself. If only I had tried harder. If only I had done X instead of Y. Sometimes bad results happen no matter what you do, and accepting that is uncomfortable. So the mind invents a story in which you were in command all the time, even when it wasn't. In a way, the illusion of control is paradox. It is false, but it helps you feel more stable. It is not entirely real, but it shapes real behavior. And although it can sometimes protect your confidence, it can also distort your understanding of risk, responsibility, and the true nature of uncertainty. Letting go of this illusion does not mean giving up. It means seeing reality more clearly, knowing the difference between what you can control, what you can influence, and what you simply must accept. You think you know your own mind better than anyone else. But the truth is that it often is not so. That is the illusion of introspection. The false belief that you have special access to the reasons for your thoughts, decisions, and feelings. You assume that if you believe something, it is because you have thought about it carefully. If you have made a decision, it must be for a logical reason. If you feel something, it must reflect a deeper truth. But in reality, much of what drives you occurs below the surface, outside your awareness, and your mind fills in the gaps with assumptions that seem like certainties. This illusion is so convincing that we rarely question it. When you decide that you like a certain shirt, you can say that it is because of the color or because it fits well without realizing that you have been subtly influenced by an advertisement you have seen or what another person was wearing previously. When they ask you why you voted a certain way, you could give a thoughtful explanation. But studies show that people often make political decisions emotionally or intuitively, and then justify them a posteriori with reasons that seem rational. And when you judge other people, you normally assume that they're influenced by prejudices or by the pressure of their peers, while you insist that your own opinions come from deep reflection and from your inner truth. This creates a strange imbalance. You treat your own beliefs as transparent windows to reality and the beliefs of others as tinted, distorted lenses. But you are not an exception. You're simply not aware of how much your mind edits, filters, and rewrites your own thoughts. The illusion of introspection is not about lying to oneself on purpose. It is about how the brain builds a narrative that seems coherent, even if it is incomplete or erroneous. It is not malicious. It is simply how we are programmed. The danger is that this illusion makes us excessively trust our own reasoning and dismiss others too quickly as irrational. It divides people, blocks empathy, and turns off curiosity. Because if you already understand yourself perfectly, what remains to be explored? But the truth is that the mind is deeper, stranger, and more mysterious than it seems at first glance. And sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, I don't fully know why I think what I think, but I am willing to find out. You think you understand how something works until someone asks you to explain it. Suddenly, your confidence begins to crumble. That is the illusion of explanatory depth. It is the feeling that you understand complex systems better than you really do. Think of a bicycle or a toilet. You use them every day. You have seen them all your life. You think you understand how they work until someone tells you, okay, explain it to me step by step, and then you realize that you cannot. This illusion does not apply only to physical objects. It appears in politics, science, philosophy, and almost all areas of life. You may feel that you understand how the economy works or why a certain policy is good or bad. But when they ask you to explain it in detail, without buzzwords or slogans, you are blocked. That is when the difference between feeling informed and being informed becomes evident. The illusion comes from confusing familiarity with understanding. Since you have heard about something so many times, your brain files it as known, even if you have never really thought about how it works. It is like passing every day in front of the same tree and taking it for granted that you could draw all its branches from memory. You cannot, but your brain never had to know it until it was tested. What makes this illusion so powerful and dangerous is that it fuels overconfidence. It makes us believe that we are qualified to debate, discuss, or make decisions about things that we barely understand. And when everyone around us has the same illusion, conversations become superficial echoes of certainty instead of deep explorations of the truth. But there is something liberating in recognizing it. Once you admit that you do not know how something works, you open the door to curiosity instead of pretending that you already have the answer. So the next time you feel sure, ask yourself, could I teach this to a child without skipping steps? If not, you may be under the spell of the illusion of explanatory depth, and you would not be the only one. Repeat a word over and over like door, 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 door. And after a while, it begins to feel strange. It sounds strange, like a noise devoid of meaning, as if it were no longer even a real word. That is semantic satiation. It is a small, strange flaw in how the brain connects language with meaning. When you repeat a word too many times in a short space of time, your neurons basically get tired of firing in the same way, and the connection between the sound and its meaning temporarily breaks. You are left alone with the pure sound, stripped of the concept to which it had previously referred. It is a harmless effect, but it highlights something profound and disturbing about how fragile meaning is. We like to think that words are solid and reliable, but they are nothing more than patterns, sounds, or shapes that we have trained our brains to associate with ideas. Semantic satiation shows how quickly those associations can fade with repetition, as if the meaning we depend on were only loosely attached to the symbols we use. This illusion also hints at how much of our reality is constructed. Language not only helps us to communicate. In fact, it shapes how we think, how we categorize the world, and how we feel about it. And yet, with enough repetition, that scaffolding begins collapsing. The word dissolves into a sound. Meaning becomes more elusive. The connection evaporates, even if only for a few seconds. And perhaps that is what makes this bias so disturbing. It is not just a peculiarity of the brain. It is a reminder that what seems obvious, solid, and meaningful can turn into noise with just a little pressure. Repeat it now. Door, door, door. What was once familiar now sound hollow. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet carried out a series of experiments that shook the foundations of how we think about free will. He asked several people to move their fingers when they wanted and to report the moment they decided to move them. Meanwhile, their brain activity was being recorded. What he discovered was very strange. A peak in brain activity occurred, called readiness potential, before the person was aware of their decision. In other words, the brain had already begun to prepare the movement before the person thought, "I'm going to move now." This discovery gave rise to a disturbing and profound question. If the brain initiates the action before we decide to do it, then who or what is really in control? This suggests that what we experience as a conscious choice could be just a story we tell ourselves after the fact. The decision was already underway. Our consciousness only arrived late to the party. Some scientists argue that this does not completely refute free will. It could simply mean that the decision is made in parts of the brain that you are not yet conscious of. Others believe that this questions the very idea of a unified conscious self that makes decisions in real time. It raises the possibility that consciousness is not the engine of your actions, but rather a narrator who explains them after they happen. The implications are truly enormous. If your sense of control is delayed, is your will truly free? Is responsibility just an illusion? And what does this mean for morality, for the law, for the way we judge ourselves and others? The readiness potential of Libet does not answer these questions, but it opens the door to a strange and fascinating possibility, that the you who believes you are making decisions is actually the last to know. There are people who live with two separate minds within the same body, and most of the time, you'll never know. That is the split brain illusion. It comes from an uncommon but real medical procedure called corpus callosotomy, in which the bridge between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum, is cut, usually to treat severe epilepsy. What happens next is one of the strangest discoveries in neuroscience. Each side of the brain continues to function, but they stop sharing information, and yet the person still feels like a unified being. Here is where things get strange. The left side of the brain, which is usually responsible for language, cannot communicate directly with the right side, which often processes visual and spatial information. Therefore, if an image is shown only to the right hemisphere, such as a photo of a snowy landscape, and then the person is asked to say what they have seen, they will say that they have not seen anything. But if they are asked to point to a shovel, their left hand will do so perfectly. The hand knows what the person does not, because the two sides no longer communicate with each other. Even stranger, if you ask the person to explain why they have chosen the shovel, the hemisphere that speaks, the left brain, will invent something like, "Oh, I saw the messy garage, and I thought about cleaning it." It is not just confusion. It is the left brain inventing a story to maintain the illusion of unity. It does not know the true reason, so it creates a false one to avoid admitting its ignorance. This illusion forces us to ask ourselves, what is the self? If a brain can be divided and end up with two centers of consciousness, which is the real self? Or have there always been multiple selves united so perfectly that we have never noticed it? Split brain patients can lead normal lives, have a job, hold conversations, and consider themselves a single person. But deep down, their brain is divided. Two minds coexist in the same body, like roommates in an apartment, each with their own vision of the world. You often look back and feel that events were inevitable, that things had to happen just as they did. That is deterministic bias. It is the illusion that the results are the product of a clear, linear chain of causes, when, in reality, the world is full of chance and unpredictability. When something happens, an accident, a success, a disaster, you automatically start to explain it with orderly stories. They were always going to succeed, or that relationship was doomed from the start. You connect the dots backwards, turning chance into logic and spontaneity into destiny. This bias comforts us. It makes the world seem more orderly, more explainable. If everything happens for a reason, then maybe nothing is really out of our control. But the truth is that much of what happens depends on the moment, luck, Context, things that no one could have foreseen. A small change, a single moment, and the story could unfold differently. However, once we know the result, it is difficult to imagine how it could not have happened. That is why people say that they always knew that a company would be successful after it became famous, or that a person's downfall was obvious in retrospect, even when no one saw it coming at the time. Deterministic bias also manifests in how we judge others. We blame people for their failures as if they had total control, forgetting the invisible social, economic, and psychological forces that shape their decisions. We expect people to have acted differently, even when we would not have done better in their place. And when it comes to our own lives, we sometimes rewrite the past, convincing ourselves that we chose paths that we actually stumbled upon, as if every move was part of a master plan. But life is not a script. It is rather a branching tree of possibilities full of what if and could have been. Deterministic bias closes those branches, flattening the complexity of reality into a single orderly story. And although that story may be satisfying, it is often more of an illusion than the truth. You feel like you're making decisions freely, choosing what to eat, when to speak, what to believe. But many of those decisions are more predictable than you think. That is the illusion of free will. The deep conviction that you make the decisions when, in many cases, your brain follows patterns established by biology, habits, the environment, and even the moment. Researchers have found that the brain often decides before we are aware of it. In a famous experiment, brain activity indicative of a decision was detected several hundred milliseconds before the person consciously reported making that decision. It is as if the mind silently wrote the script and only then handed it over to the part of us that feels like the author. This illusion also manifests in the way we form opinions. You may think that you have weighed the pros and cons and have reached a logical conclusion, but often your brain makes a quick decision based on your instincts, your emotions, or social influence. And then your rational brain intervenes to justify it. The choice seems deliberate, but the foundations were laid long before your conscious mind was involved. Marketing pushes you, the context prepares you, framing influences you, and past experiences that you barely remember shape you. Even your preferences can be influenced by something as insignificant as whether you are hungry, tired, or saw a certain color 5 seconds ago. And, nevertheless, the sensation of agency is so strong that it's hard to question. You remember having chosen the red shirt without being influenced by the lighting of the store. You remember deciding to trust someone without realizing that their voice reminded you of someone you liked as a child. Again and again, we make decisions that seem free, but are shaped by forces beyond our consciousness. This does not mean that free will is a complete illusion, but it does mean that the version of free will that we feel, the one that makes us feel that we are at the helm at all times, is much more complex than we believe. The real control we have may not reside in every decision we make, but in how we respond. Once we become aware of the patterns, once you realize everything that happens behind the scenes, you start to ask yourself deeper questions. Who really makes the decisions? And how much of you is truly under your control? You think you're experiencing the world as it is, but that's not so. What you're really experiencing is a mental reconstruction, a private simulation created by your brain. That is the core of phenomenal illusions. The idea that your conscious experience feels complete, accurate, and seamless, even though it is full of shortcuts, guesses, and gaps. Think about your field of vision. You feel like you see everything in detail at all times, but you only see a small point in high resolution. Your brain fills in the rest. Or think about color. You think you see the world with objective and real colors, but color is not something that exists out there. It is something that your mind invents to help you navigate the wavelengths of light. You feel that the world is full of rich and continuous sound, but your brain is putting together fragments of noise and translating vibrations into experience. Even the sensation of now is a phenomenal illusion. Your brain needs time to process information. However, your consciousness edits and smooths everything to make it seem like it is happening in real time. You do not notice the delay. You only feel that you are present. That is the illusion. You are not seeing reality as it is. You are seeing an easy-to-use version, like the interface of a computer that hides the code underneath. And perhaps the most powerful illusion of all is that your experience seems to be happening to a unified self. You, at the center of everything, observing, choosing, and controlling. But neuroscience suggests that your sense of self may be a constructed story, a product of distributed brain systems working together. The brain does not only simulate the world, it simulates you inside it. Phenomenal illusions do not mean that reality is unreal. They only remind us that what we experience is a filtered, elaborated, and deeply personal version of it. What seems obvious and immediate, like color, time, sound, even your sense of being yourself, is rather a rough interpretation by a mind that does its best with the data it has. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as your brain tells you it is. You start to notice patterns, too many coincidences, strange alignments, or moments that seem scripted, and then a thought arises. What if this is not real? What if we are living in a simulation? This is about the simulation hypothesis bias, the tendency to interpret failures, mysteries, or inexplicable events as evidence that reality itself is artificial. It is not necessarily about believing in the simulation theory as a scientific affirmation. It is rather about a change of perception in which the mind begins to frame daily life through the prism of, what if all of this were coded? You see a number repeat itself again and again on the clock, on receipts, in headlines, and it seems like a message to you. You think of someone and they call you. You dream something and it happens. These moments are not proof of anything, but they seem significant. And as your brain is a pattern detection machine, it fills the gaps, establishes connections, and whispers. It cannot be coincidence. The simulation hypothesis bias feeds on that feeling. It transforms ambiguity to evidence. Instead of that is rare, it becomes the simulation is failing. This bias is fueled by pop culture and technological culture alike. Movies, video games, and science fiction make the idea of simulated worlds seem plausible and familiar. If we add the rise of virtual reality and artificial intelligence to this, it is easier to imagine that consciousness itself could be part of a digital framework. And once the idea is implanted, it is difficult to stop seeing it. Even perfectly normal things begin to seem orchestrated, as if the universe were pushing you, as if your reality was being curated. The danger is that this bias can take you from the rawness of life. It can create a sense of unreality that numbs emotions, distances relationships, and blurs the lines between imagination with observation. On one hand, it can be playful philosophical curiosity. On the other, it can become a profound existential doubt. Because if everything is false, what really matters? But perhaps that is the trick. The bias does not prove that the world is simulated. It only shows how easy it is for the human mind to question the ground it treads on. Whether the simulation is real or not, the feeling of questioning it is real. And that by itself says something profound about the very nature of consciousness. You see the world through human eyes because you are human. But this creates a powerful illusion that humans are the most important thing that exists. That everything in the universe revolves around us, or should. This is about the anthropocentric bias, which is so ingrained in our thinking that we often don't even notice it. We take it for granted that intelligence resembles human intelligence, and that life elsewhere would behave like us. That meaning must have something to do with us. Even when we talk about saving the planet, we usually mean saving it for ourselves. When we look at animals, we measure their value by their resemblance to humans. A chimpanzee that uses a stick to catch termites is considered intelligent. But a jellyfish that is carried away by the current is nothing more than a shapeless mass. We care more about dogs and dolphins than about insects or plants. Although all organisms are part of the same complex web of life, it is not that we have thought about it carefully. This is how our mind is built. Our language, our stories, our science, even our religions tend to place humanity at the center as a focus of attention, as a reason for the story, as an exception to the rule. This bias extends also to science and philosophy. We interpret randomness as intention and coincidence as meaning. When we see patterns in nature, we assume they exist for our benefit. A beautiful sunset must be for our enjoyment. A cure in the rainforest must have been put there for us to discover. We are not wrong to feel awe, but awe does not mean ownership. Even the idea that the Earth is in a Goldilocks zone is an anthropocentric term. It is not too hot, nor too cold. It is perfect for us. But the universe is not trying to be comfortable. It simply is. What we see as special could just be a rare coincidence, filtered through a lens that is always looking for meaning. Recognizing the anthropocentric bias does not make humans less important. It simply puts us in context. It reminds us that we are part of something unimaginably vast, not the authors of it. And, curiously, that can be more humble and meaningful than believing that everything was created for us. Because it means that meaning is not given to us. It is something that we create. You yearn for certainty. You want answers, conclusions, a sensation of finality, because uncertainty makes you feel as if you were stepping on unstable ground. That is the illusion of cognitive closure. The comforting but deceptive sensation that you have discovered it, that things are resolved, that you finally know how the world works. It is not only about knowledge. It is about relief. In a moment in which a confusing event or a complex problem receives a label, an explanation, or a story that makes sense, your brain relaxes. You feel safe, but that sensation can be deceptive. This illusion leads you to draw hasty conclusions only to escape from the discomfort of not knowing. It is possible that you accept the first explanation that seems plausible to you, not because it is the best, but because it allows you to stop thinking. That is why conspiracy theories are so attractive. They offer clear and complete stories for chaotic events. That is why people cling to rigid ideologies or beliefs, even when the evidence suggests nuances or complexity. Once your mind believes that it has closed a matter, it resists reopening that door. This bias also manifests in daily life. You hear a rumor, and you believe it instantly because it fills a void. You misinterpret the tone of a friend, assume the worst, and stop asking questions because it is easier to be sure than to continue with the uncertainty. You diagnose someone's behavior with a simple label: toxic, jealous, crazy, and you move on without stopping to ask yourself if the whole story could be more complicated. The danger of the illusion of cognitive closure is that it blocks curiosity. It tells you that the work of thinking has finished when in reality, it has only just begun. And although some decisions in life must be made quickly, the most important questions about people, purpose, and reality are rarely clarified immediately. Sometimes, the most sensible thing is to maintain the uncertainty a bit longer. Admit that you still do not know it. At this moment, you are seeing colors, hearing sounds, feeling the weight of your body, and perhaps even thinking about what all this means. And, nevertheless, everything seems like a unified experience. That is the fundamental problem of consciousness. How does your brain take millions of separate signals, sight, hearing, touch, thought, memory, and combine them into a moment of seamless consciousness? Your visual system processes color in one area and movement in another. Your hearing, your sense of space, your emotions, all are managed by different regions that function independently. But you do not experience them as something separate. You experience a world, a self, a present moment. Why? There is not a central place in the brain where everything joins. Neurons communicate, yes, but they do not transmit their information to a single you sitting inside your head watching the show. Neuroscience has mapped how the different functions occur, but nobody knows how those pieces come together in consciousness itself. It is as if someone took thousands of puzzle pieces from different puzzles, scattered them randomly, and somehow you ended up seeing a perfect image every second. Some theories say that it is about synchronization, that neurons activate at the same time. Others suggest that it is more like a narrative in which the brain tells itself a story to maintain coherence. But even those ideas only displace the mystery. Why does synchronization create the sensation of unity? Why does a narrative make you feel as if you were living the story? And what is it that lives the experience? The problem of union is not only a failure in our understanding of the brain. It is a deep question about what it means to have a mind. Why does your consciousness not feel like a collection of disconnected data flows? Why do you feel that you are here now, living a moment that somehow makes sense? The brain is made up of parts, but the mind, your mind, feels like a whole. And nobody knows entirely why. One can describe how the brain works with incredible detail, how neurons activate, how signals transmit, how certain chemicals correlate with emotions and thoughts. But none of that explains why it feels like something that is you. That is the hard problem of consciousness. Why does all this brain activity not simply occur in the dark without any internal experience? Why does pain hurt, red look red, or music excite you? We can measure brain activity when you feel joy, but that doesn't tell us how joy feels from within. That subjective quality, what philosophers call qualia, is the core of the mystery. It's not just a technical problem. It is a philosophical wall that we run into again and again. We can build machines that mimic decision-making, recognize faces, respond to voices, but do they experience something? Or do they only simulate the appearance of thought and feelings? And what would be considered proof that something is conscious? The hard problem reminds us that consciousness is not just a matter of function or behavior. It's about experience. And no scientific equation, no brain scanner, no algorithm has yet managed to bridge the gap between physical processes and the personal feeling of being alive. Some people think we will end up deciphering it. Others believe that we are missing something fundamental and that consciousness could be completely beyond the reach of physical science. Perhaps it is an emerging property. Perhaps it is integrated into the fabric of the universe. Or perhaps it is something that we do not yet have the right language to describe. But one thing is certain. You are aware. You are experiencing this moment. And no one, not even the best scientist in the world, can fully explain why. That is the hard problem of consciousness. It's not just difficult. It is possibly the deepest mystery of existence. You think there is a solid self behind your thoughts, feelings, and experiences. A central self that is coherent, unified, and in control. But that feeling of a permanent self may be just an illusion. The more you observe your mind, the harder it is to find a unique place where you reside. Your memories change over time. Your personality changes in different situations. Your thoughts come and go like the weather. However, you feel that there is a you that unites everything. That is the illusion of self. You can imagine your mind as a movie theater with a little person inside, watching how your life unfolds. But who watches that person? And who watches the observer? The more you delve, the more the idea of a unique and immutable self fades. Neuroscience has never found a center of self. Instead, it finds countless systems working together, processing vision, language, emotions, decision-making, all of them flexibly coordinated. But without any part being clearly in command, consciousness emerges from this collaboration, without the need for a fixed identity behind it. This illusion is deeply rooted. You take credit for your decisions, even though studies show that many occur before you are even aware of having made them. You tell stories about your life to make it seem coherent, even though those stories are constantly edited, revised, and filtered through emotions and retrospect. You consider yourself a unique and unified being. But the truth is that you're more like a multitude of voices taking turns with a microphone. One moment you are calm and rational. The next you are impulsive and reactive. And later you reflect on it all as if you were the narrator of someone else's story. Self-delusion isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, it helps you to navigate through the world, build relationships, and maintain a sense of stability. But also traps you. You cling to your ego, defend your image, and fear losing something never fixed to begin with. Letting go of illusion doesn't mean you stop existing. It means stopping clinging to the idea that you're a solid, unique thing. You're not a noun. You're a process. And realizing that can be the most liberating revelation of all. You can think about your own thinking, but not as deeply or clearly as you believe. That is metacognitive myopia, a blind spot in understanding your own cognitive limits. You may be good at detecting flaws in the reasoning of others, but when it comes to your own mind, you are less objective than you think. You think you are fair, rational, and open-minded, but you do not see how biases, emotions, shortcuts, and invisible habits shape your thoughts, which you rarely question. You think you're paying attention, but you're missing key details. You think that you're being logical, but you may just rationalize. And despite everything, you feel safe because the mind does not easily reveal its blind spots. It's like trying to see your own eyes without any mirror. The tools you use to evaluate your thinking are the same, one's already biased. If your logic is wrong, your judgment about it will be too. That is the trap. You may realize when you forget something, but not the things you have never known. You are aware when you change your mind, but you're not always aware of how difficult it is for you to change it. You think your beliefs are based on evidence, but they are often based on intuition, emotion, or social pressure, which you then justify with reasons. And even when you know these traps exist, that knowledge doesn't automatically help you avoid them. You may even feel that you are an exception. This illusion of self-awareness can feel comforting. It makes you feel in control, intelligent, and safe, but also prevents growth. It is difficult to improve your thinking if you overestimate how well you already think. You may reject feedback too quickly or ignore contradictions too easily. You think you see things clearly, but your brain is quietly smoothing out complexities, filtering out uncomfortable truths, and filling in the gaps with guesses. Metacognitive myopia is why humility matters. I am not referring to the false modesty that continues to assume you are right for the most part, but rather to the uncomfortable awareness that your own mind often hides from itself. It is a reminder that clarity requires effort, self-confidence requires caution, and even your most confident thoughts may be built on invisible sand. There are some thoughts that can never fully settle, like chasing your tail with logic. That is the strange territory of Gödel reason loops, named after the mathematician Kurt Gödel. These loops reveal a fundamental truth. In any system complex enough to describe itself, there will be statements that cannot be proven but are true within that system. It's like trying to define the word dictionary using only the word dictionary. You end up in a loop, circular, self-referential, and impossible to complete. This isn't just a problem for mathematicians. It is a philosophical wake-up call. It means that, however coherent your vision of the world, there will always be truths that escape through the cracks. Truths that your system cannot reach without breaking its own rules. You can build a belief system that seems infallible, but if it tries to explain itself completely, it collapses inward. It is like using a book to demonstrate the book's accuracy. It cannot get out of itself to validate itself. This loop also appears in real life. Think about this question. Can everything be explained rationally? If you try to answer that question using only rational tools, you get trapped in the same framework that you are questioning. You cannot get out of your own mind to fully verify the conclusions of your mind. It is the same paradox as a sentence that says, "This statement is unprovable." If it is true, it is unprovable. But if it is unprovable, then it must be true. The Gaudian loops remind us that some parts of reality may always remain out of our reach. Not because we are not intelligent enough, but because the structure of thought itself has blind spots. Even logic, the most reliable tool of human reason, has inherent limits. The more you delve, the more you realize. The mind cannot be completely contained. There is always a corner that you cannot see completely. What if everything you believe, everything you see, hear, feel, and think is being manipulated by something smarter than you? That is the disturbing idea that lies behind the illusion of the evil demon. Imagine a powerful being, not evil in the Hollywoodian sense, but cunning and completely dedicated to deceiving you. It feeds you with false sensations, false memories, false logic, creating a perfect illusion of reality. You touch a cup of hot coffee, you hear the hum of your refrigerator, you are sure that 2 + 2 = 4. But What if all those experiences have been carefully implanted in your mind by a deceiver? Not only your senses, but also your thoughts, your entire reasoning process could be part of the trick. René Descartes used this scenario not because she thought it was likely, but because she wanted to find out what could be known with absolute certainty, if anything could be known. If an evil demon could fabricate all your experiences, then even the most obvious truths could be illusions. Perhaps the world does not exist. Perhaps your body does not exist. Perhaps nothing you have known is real. Descartes took skepticism to the limit until he reached one thing that the demon could not falsify: your awareness that you're thinking. Even if you're being deceived, there must be a you that is being deceived. That is where he came to his famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." But this is where it gets weird. In a modern context, the illusion of the evil demon is very similar to a simulated reality, like Matrix or a computer-generated world. It forces you to ask yourself, how do you know that your thoughts are not being provided to you by something else? If your brain can be deceived by dreams, illusions, hallucinations, or even simple magic tricks, how much more could a super-intelligent trickster deceive you? And if it could, how could you know? This illusion does not only make you doubt the world, it makes you doubt the very tools you use to understand it. Your senses, your logic, your intuition, everything can be hijacked. It is a terrifying and radical idea, but also in a strange way liberating. Because if you can question everything, maybe you can also rebuild your understanding from scratch. Not based on what you've been told or what suits you, but on what really can survive doubt. You confuse your ideas about reality with reality itself. That is the confusion between the map and the territory. The map is your mental model. The words, beliefs, symbols, theories, or categories that you use to navigate the world. The territory is what really exists, regardless of how you describe it. But once the map becomes detailed and familiar, it begins to look like what it represents. You start to act as if your labels were the truth. You stop questioning the limits of your understanding and start to confuse the label with the thing, the concept with the experience, the word with the world. Think about how we use names. When you call someone lazy, you create a shortcut, a map that reduces a complex human being to a single trait. You stop seeing everything that he is and only see the idea that you have assigned to him. When you call a place dangerous, a person evil, or a country advanced, you are compressing layers of nuance into something your brain can easily assimilate. But it is a map, not the complete terrain. Maps are necessary. We need them to think, plan, and communicate. But they're always simplifications. And when we forget that, we begin living in an illusion. Science does this too. A model of the atom is not an atom. A psychological diagnosis is not a person. A political ideology is not reality. Even our sense of self, our history of who we are, is a kind of map. It is useful for navigating life, but it is never the complete picture. The problem arises when we confuse these tools with the truth itself, and then close ourselves off to everything that does not fit them. This bias becomes dangerous when people defend the map with more ferocity than they dedicate to exploring the territory. They cling to ideologies, identities, and theories, and treat challenges to those ideas as threats. But ideas are tools, not truths. The moment you forget that, the map becomes a cage instead of a guide. Understanding the confusion between the map and the territory does not mean discarding your beliefs. It means being aware that your beliefs are representations, approximations, and being willing to update your map when the territory proves otherwise. There is a strange thought that may cross your mind late at night or during a quiet, solitary walk. What if you were the only conscious being that exists? What if everyone else, your friends, your family, all the strangers you meet on the street, were just part of an elaborate illusion? That idea is called solipsism. And the trap of solipsism is the mental spiral in which it can plunge you. It is the disturbing feeling that, although you can be sure of your own thoughts and experiences, you cannot prove that someone else has a mind like yours. You will see people laugh, cry, talk, and act as if they were alive inside. But all that could be just external behavior, reflexes, simulations, even programmed responses in a dream or in a game that you are playing without knowing it. It is not just a philosophical question. It is a psychological trap that can distort your vision of the world. If you fall too much into it, you can start to feel isolated, disconnected, or even paranoid. After all, if no one else is real, then nothing really matters outside your own mind. Love, trust, morality. Do they still make sense if you're the only one who really experiences them? The trap of solipsism plays with the limits of human perception. You cannot directly experience the consciousness of another person. You cannot enter their thoughts or feel their emotions from within. Therefore, there's always that persistent doubt. How do you know they are really there? Most people dismiss the idea and move on. But for some, it remains in the background as a failure in the matrix. It can make reality seem fragile, dreamlike, or artificial. And, ironically, the more intelligent or introspective you are, the easier it is to fall into these types of questions. But here is the key. The fact that you cannot prove something does not mean that it is not real. Probably, other people do have a mind. They react. They surprise you. They disagree with you. They comfort you in ways that no programmed illusion ever could. And even if you were the only conscious being in the universe, wouldn't it make sense to live as if others mattered? Choosing empathy, kindness, and meaning not because you know they are real, but because you hope they are. The trap of solipsism is not a dead end. It is a reminder of how limited and yet how powerful our perception is. It shows how fragile and mysterious consciousness truly is. But instead of falling into a spiral of doubt, you can use it to deepen your appreciation for the strange and beautiful possibility that we are not alone. That each mind you meet is a universe of its own, as real and alive as yours. You want to believe that you can build a perfectly closed knowledge system in which all questions have answers. That all beliefs fit perfectly into a larger picture and that all contradictions can be resolved finally. But the truth is you cannot. That is what the failure of epistemic closure reveals. The disturbing reality that your understanding of the world may never be completely closed. Like an incomplete puzzle with missing pieces that you cannot even identify. You might think, if I keep learning, I will eventually discover everything. But the more you know, the more you realize how much remains uncertain or even unknowable. You could answer a question only to discover that it opens up 10 more. You form beliefs based on logic, evidence, and experience. But no matter how carefully you build your worldview, there's always something outside the system that cannot be explained. New data, changing perspectives, unknown unknowns. This is especially frustrating because you feel like there should be closure. You long for it. The mind wants completeness. It wants to feel that it has control over reality. But reality does not always cooperate. Philosophers run into it when they try to define knowledge itself. Scientists find it at the limits of what can be measured. Mathematicians face it in paradoxes and undecidable truths. Even in your daily life, you face it when you try to reconcile opposing beliefs or explain something you feel but cannot articulate. The failure of epistemic closure does not mean that you cannot know anything. It means that you probably cannot know everything, and above all, not in the hermetic and autonomous way that your mind would desire. There will always be cracks, gaps, and mysteries, places where certainty slips through your fingers. The illusion is that one more theory, one more advance, one more idea will finally complete the picture. And yet, this is not a failure of thought. It is a characteristic of being human. Living with openness instead of closure is staying curious, humble, and awake. It is accepting that the world is bigger than the models we create of it, and that wisdom sometimes means letting the unknown remain unknown. You live your life assuming that reality is there, solid, obvious, reliable. You trust your senses, your memories, your thoughts. The world seems stable, full of objects, people, and rules. But the more you wonder what real really means, the more it slips out of your hands. This is the illusion of reality itself. The quiet and disturbing possibility that everything you take for granted may be some kind of dream, a projection, a construction, or something much stranger than you can imagine. Science tells you that your senses are easily deceived. Optical illusions, false memories, virtual simulations. They all show how easy it is to experience something vividly without it being real. Philosophy goes further. How do you know you are not in a simulation? How do you know that there is something beyond your mind? Even the language you use to describe the world is just a map, not the territory. Words like time, matter, and I seem intuitive, but if you analyze them carefully, they dissolve into paradoxes, probabilities, and abstractions. You see colors, but it is only your brain interpreting wavelengths. You feel solidity, but atoms are mostly empty space. You remember the past, but your memory is rebuilt, not recorded faithfully. Each part of your experience is filtered through a mind that you have not designed, shaped by biases that you have not chosen, that operates in a universe that you do not fully understand. And yet, you keep going, confidently labeling things as real or fake, true or false. You have just explored 100 ways in which the mind distorts reality through illusions that deceive your senses and biases that quietly shape your beliefs, decisions, and identity. Some were fun, others disturbing, and others pointed towards something much deeper. That the way you think is not always something you can fully control. Cognitive illusions reveal that what you see is not always what's there. Cognitive biases show that what you believe is not always true. Together, they form the strange, beautiful, imperfect machinery of human thought. But awareness is power. The more clearly you see the distortions, the more clearly you can see yourself. So stay open, stay aware, and above all, remain curious. Thank you for watching Level 1 of 100 Illusions and Cognitive Biases. See you in the next one.